Adina?
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to call to order tonight's regular meeting of the Tiburon Town Council for Wednesday, June 7th. Madam Clerk, could we call the roll, please?
Councilmember Thier is absent. Councilmember Wellner,
Here.
Vice Mayor Fredericks here, and Mayor Ryan.
Here, thank you. So before we get into the regular part of our agenda, we have public comment period for anyone who wants to make a statement about something that's not on tonight's agenda. So at this time, we'll take people in the chambers who want to do that, and then we'll go to people online for their comments. And before I start, I'd love to have Madam Clerk give instructions to people who might want to comment.
Thank you. If you're calling in on Zoom and would like to make a comment during this meeting, please use the raise hand feature of Zoom, which will indicate to me you'd like to make a comment. You can find the raise hand button on your webinar controls bar on the bottom of your Zoom window or smartphone screen. If you're using Zoom, I'll invite you to turn your camera and microphone on to address the council. Please accept the request from the Zoom host that you're being promoted to a panelist. If you're calling and using a phone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand.
Thank you very much. Do we have anybody in the chambers who wants to make a comment about something that's not on the agenda? Please come forward to the podium, and I know you can come up to the podium and then state your name into the microphone. You'll have 3 minutes to speak. Welcome.
My name is Noreen Slavan. I have property at 2090 Paradise. I'm in the process of converting getting an ADU. And it's for what used to be a legal apartment for about 40 years. And we took out the kitchen a couple of years ago under a complicated remodel I'm not going to go into. And to help the town fulfill the requirement, I thought, oh, this is a good time to put this kitchen back in, even though I don't need to because they have roommates and it's working out. And I just want to express that it's a frustrating process and expensive to go through. And I think if we want other people in the community to do similar things to help with this issue, it needs to be more mainstreamed and easy. And I think something like a committee or the town planner physically coming to the space to understand what that space is versus trying to fill out paperwork and trying to get an architect to draw plans, not knowing if it's come to fruition in the end. Again, I've spoken with some neighbors that have some legal similar space, and they're all hesitant to come forward because it's an onerous process. And I think it should be a very easy thing to address. And if I was around more, I'd offer to be on that committee.
Thank you.
I've
Thank you.
been involved in some similar things.
And I'm sorry, could you, what was your name again? Could you repeat?
Noreen Slavan. And yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there anyone else in the chambers who wants to make a comment on something not on tonight's agenda? Madam Clerk, do we have anyone online?
Seeing none.
Okay, so I'll close the open comment period. And now we'll move on to the consent agenda. Are there any members of the council who want to take anything off tonight's consent agenda? Seeing none, is there any members of the public who'd like to make a comment on on any of the consent items? Anybody online that you see, Madam Clerk?
Seeing none.
Seeing none, so I'll close the public comment period there. Anyone want to make a motion to approve the consent calendar?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor of approving the consent calendar, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, so the consent calendar passes 3-0. And now we'll move on to the public hearings portion. Public hearing 1 is contemplating municipal code amendments. Do we have a staff report, please? Somewhere in those folders?
No, somewhere up here. Am I on? Yeah. Good evening. I have Bob Brown here, who was the consultant who drafted our zoning text amendment. And he's going to do the presentation tonight. And myself and Mary Wagner will be here for questions. I know there are quite a few we received today. So with that, I'm going to open up to that so you have enough time for the presentation. Bob?
Good evening, Mayor Ryan, members of the council. Thank you. So tonight we're following up on your action at your last meeting. Oh, perfect. That's okay. Your action at your last meeting adopting the 2040 general plan and the 2023 to 2031 housing element. So tonight we'll be talking about some major implementation measures following up from those two adoptions to achieve consistency with the new general plan and your zoning code. So tonight we're going to talk about a couple of new zoning districts and amendments to your zoning map to achieve consistency with the new general plan. And then we'll talk about the objective development and design standards, the odds, I'll abbreviate in the future presentation. And those are intended to regulate development in your downtown mixed-use districts. We'll talk about where the odds will apply, and then we'll talk about what they're trying to achieve. And then I'll go into some examples from the code as to how those objectives are being realized in the code itself. And then we'll intersperse a discussion about the Planning Commission recommendations as part of this. So just to remind the council, this has come before you before. We had 3 initial design review board meetings about a year ago when we started working on the objective development design standards, the odds. The Planning Commission saw the draft in November. The council saw a draft in February. And then on May 24th, the Planning Commission held their formal public hearing for adoption and made recommendations to you. So first of all, the zoning regulations and zoning map. The great majority of properties in Tiburon are not going to be changed at all in terms of zoning, but there are a few specifics. So 2 of the housing sites identified in the housing element are proposed for rezoning. One is the vacant portion of the Reed School site, which is currently zoned. It is RMP, and it is proposed to be rezoned to a new R4 zone. And for that district, it requires a minimum number of housing units, 20 units per acre, and a maximum of 25. The other site that came into the process fairly late was a proposal for 4576 Paradise. And so that property is currently zoned RPD, and the proposal would be to change the zoning to a new R310 zone. And the regulations for R310 are the same as R3, your current zoning of R3. But the difference is that it requires a minimum housing density of 10 units per acre in compliance with the housing element and a maximum of 12.4. So those are the 2 proposals for residential rezonings. And then we have a number in the downtown. So we have a new proposed mixed use zone along Tiburon Boulevard that will change the zoning of 3 parcels on the far left that are zoned office, and then a few on Tiburon Boulevard that are currently zoned neighborhood commercial. And then going down Beach Road on the south side, there are, I think, 4 parcels that are currently zoned village commercial, and they would also be rezoned to mixed use. And then we have another new zoning district, which is Main Street, and appropriately, it's on Main Street. It's being rezoned from Village Commercial to the Main Street designation. So mixed use in terms of allowing residential or mixed use projects would allow densities between 30 and 35 units an acre. And on the Main Street zone, it would allow densities between 20 and 25. And both of those zones would allow buildings 2 or 3 stories in height and up to 45 feet maximum, except when they're within proximity to a residential zone. And in that case, the building height would come down to 2 stories and a maximum of 35 feet. As part of the effort on the code amendments, currently the neighborhood commercial and the downtown zoning districts have a very long list of allowable uses, a laundry list. And the intent here was to categorize those, to join them into categories like retail or personal service or household and business services. And that would be for the ease of use of the tables. And also part of the effort was to take those categories that really are typically fairly benign, like retail, for example, or personal services, things like, hair cutting, nail salons, that sort of thing, that typically don't have a lot of operational issues. And to change those from being conditional uses that all require a use permit from the Planning Commission to establish or to expand, and to make them permitted uses. And the idea was to streamline the process, both for applicants in terms of time and money, and also the amount of staff time that's devoted to processing all these use permits. And then really focus use permits on the categories that can be more problematic. And so again, that was the intent here. We did also add provisions that prohibit firearm sales. That was a carryover from your current code, and fast food services are disallowed in these districts. And in addition, we added adult entertainment because it has to be there under the First Amendment. And so there is a provision for adult entertainment in mixed use if that should ever happen. The Planning Commission took a very hard look at these tables. And I think the biggest change they made very appropriately was to retain food and beverage uses, things like restaurants, bars, wine shops, to keep those as conditional uses. And that's very appropriate because restaurants, et cetera, have operational issues that really warrant examination and regulation. So that is the major change here. We also they moved grocery stores from food and beverage to retail, so it's a permitted use there. And then they also shifted auto sales and rentals and auto parts stores from retail into automotive services, and those then all require a conditional use permit. These are the basic site standards for the downtown districts. I mentioned the residential densities a minute ago, but there are also floor area ratios that are proposed to accommodate, again, these somewhat larger buildings that could be multifamily or mixed use. So now what I'd like to talk about are the odds, the objective design and development standards. The council's had presentations from the town attorney, from our consulting group, and I'm sure you've heard this at all the league conferences, all the new state laws that seek to streamline the development review process and really limit local discretion as a means of trying to encourage housing production. And so there are some specific laws that refer to the approval process utilizing only objective development and design standards, odds. And so things like, this is the definition of objective standards under the state law. They can involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official and have to be verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark that's knowable by both the development applicant and the public officials. And so things like, numeric standards like setbacks, height limits, those are all objective, and you have those currently in your code. But most of your design standards are based on subjective findings. So things like finding that the building is in character with its surroundings. Those are no longer allowed in terms of making decisions on applications. And so we've tried, you can imagine what goes into designing a building that's aesthetically pleasing. There's a lot to it. And, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But what these odds have tried to do is really sort of try to break down the various components that make up a building, the height, the facade, the location on the site, all those things, and try to quantify them as best as possible. So it's kind of a daunting task and certainly not perfect, but it's better than having no standards and essentially allowing a developer to come in with a square box building and say, this is what you get. So again, the purpose of this is based on the new state laws. And for those projects that qualify under SB 35, or now in 2 weeks, AB 2011, those projects, if they comply with the adopted local odds, then they have to be ministerially approved by staff. So there's no public hearings, no design review. So that's the importance of the odds here. For other projects that don't qualify, meet all the state qualifications under those two laws, and they're still adding 2 or more new housing units. In those cases, you can still run your typical discretionary review process, your design review, your use permits. But what you can't do is if the project meets the odds, you can't reduce the density or deny the project. So you can still condition it to modify the design. You don't like these windows. You think that there should be some additional setback in the front of the building. If it doesn't reduce density and it doesn't deny the project, you still allow that level of discretion. So the purpose of I'm sorry. Going the wrong direction.
Because it's the one we're.
Sorry, yes, I was going the wrong
Very
direction. Okay, so the odds, they only apply to new development, so new buildings, new additions, renovations in your downtown districts, and also apply to mixed-use development that occurs in neighborhood commercial. We did not develop odds for multifamily residential in your multifamily zones because back at that time, there was only one site proposed for multifamily change, and that was the Reed School site. Now you have 2 sites in play, and they're challenging sites in terms of topography, et cetera. So we are talking to staff, and I think staff may bring forward a proposal to you to create some residential odds that would apply to these 2 residential sites, but that's for another evening. So as I said, projects that add 2 or more new housing units, those would, and they meet the state laws, those would be subject to the ministerial approval process.
Can you go back one
So
second?
again,
Just want to make sure we have everything categorized here. So
surely.
the odds applied on new development downtown.
Yes.
With regard to projects, and you say 2+ new housing units would require a ministerial approval process. In order to qualify under SB 35, it needs a lot more than just 2+ new housing units.
Absolutely. This is not trying to summarize these laws in detail, but yes, under SB 35,
You have to be prevailing wage, you have to do all kinds of things.
you have to have affordable housing in there. Yes, it cannot be in a site that has wetlands and yeah.
Okay.
other-
So the second bullet that says ministerial approval process based on compliance with odds is for that limited category of special projects that qualify.
SB 35
SB
and
35.
AB 2011. Yes.
And then finally, the bottom bullet that don't require ministerial, that's what you were saying. You can have subjective review, but you, if they comply with odds, you're saying you can't reduce the density. You can do anything else though.
Exactly.
It doesn't reduce the density.
Yes,
All right, thank you.
exactly. Okay, so the intention of these odd standards, first obviously is to accommodate somewhat larger buildings that are going to be necessary to comply with the housing element mandates. But also there are a number of design objectives in the new downtown element that we wanted to implement with the odds. And also we had 3 meetings with the design review board, and those were very helpful in sort of setting the stage and defining what the design character of the town is that we're trying to emulate with these odds. So the DRB was absolutely adamant that the character of this town is what they called village scale, which are typically individually built buildings, not, block long developments, typically somewhat more vertical, and that they look like they've been built over time by different developers, because they have. They also want us to make sure we break up large sites into blocks so that we don't get these monolithic large projects. Building width is regulated so that a building can only be so wide, and beyond that, it has to have indentations to, again, break up that front facade. If it has height over 2 stories, the upper stories have to be stepped back so they're not as visible, and there has to be variation in the height of increments of a building, a larger building. And then, really important, trying to articulate that front facade so that it has some ins and outs, some shadow lines. So we do that by allowing certain different types of projections into the setback, regulating the types of entries to those buildings to make them interesting and visible, and also requiring changes in colors and materials as you get wider buildings. So the downtown element really promotes the idea of pedestrian-oriented development. So development along street frontages that really encourages pedestrians to want to, walk by, look into shop windows, gathering places, all that good stuff that we want our downtowns and our major streets to have. So here, in this case, the odds limit the ground floor commercial uses in certain locations. So, generally don't want retail spaces along the ground floor of a pedestrian activated street front. You want retail, you want restaurants, those sorts of things. You want those building entrances to be prominent. You want a minimum amount of window space and not a lot of blank walls. You want streetscape improvements, street trees, wider sidewalks. And again, on larger projects, you want some public gathering spaces. We also wanted to highlight the corner of Tiburon Boulevard and Beach Road. And that's done in some subtle ways. One is by orienting the buildings that face that intersection in a diagonal and creating little plazas in front on the corners. And then also 2 of those 4 corners requiring ground floor uses. 2 of the corners were not able to do that because those are sites that are designated for lower income housing, and the housing element, and under state law, you have to allow all residential on those sites. And the transportation element and also the downtown element really want to promote walkability and alternate transportation modes. So again, I talked about having street frontages that are active to promote pedestrian use, trying to promote paseos and courtyards that would break up larger uninterrupted blocks and create some public gathering spaces. And also there are provisions in here for parking stackers, lifts in underground garages, and also for tandem parking, trying to minimize the amount of garage space that you need to accommodate parking more efficiently. So to get into a few of the specifics, to give you some examples, this is an example of how we establish maximum block sizes. And after you get a certain width of a building, in this case, over 90 feet, so 3 of those increments that you see divided there, at that point, you've got to do a recess. So you cannot have all the building up at the setback level. You've got to create breaks in between to give a sense of separate buildings. And it also shows here that after 2 increments, after 60 feet, you have to modulate the height. So you can't have it uniformly 3 stories. You've got to go down and have some areas that are 2 stories.
I know you're not trying to show this. If you go back, I know you're not showing this for the purpose of showing what our building specifically would be like, but what is that space above the 3rd story here? That's a 4th story, isn't it?
Yeah, probably. In this case, that would not be allowed. So
Okay,
yeah,
so we
it's
would be smaller.
it's
Okay.
hard to find perfect examples.
No, it's that's why I was saying I'm not holding you to it. I just
No.
want to make sure I understand. Okay,
You're right, though, that upper story there would not be possible.
okay.
And this shows, again, the building step backs I was talking about. So again, beyond a certain point, this is the mixed use frontage along Tiburon Boulevard, where you can go up to 3 stories on a portion of the building. But then again, when it gets wider, you've got to step that down. And this shows Main Street on the left. So Main Street is different in that you can do 2 stories right at the front property line, as most of those buildings are along Main Street, 1 and 2 stories. But then if you have a 3rd story, it has to be back from there. So it's a relatively narrow street. So again, it will be fairly difficult to see that upper story from the sidewalk on either side. And then again, I mentioned that there would be requirements for commercial frontage on the ground floor. And that's the solid areas here. So certainly along Main Street, we require that there be a commercial ground floor along Arc Row. And then you can see again, it's hard to see, but there's solid lines at those two corners. The upper left and the lower right at Tiburon and Beach. Those are the two sites that we can require ground floor commercial. And this diagram shows that there are there's the requirement for the amount of building area that you have at the street frontage on a site. What we don't want to encourage this is the bottom slide where you've got a huge parking lot next to a building. So we're trying to hide parking behind or underneath buildings and require that there be more building frontage at the street, both to sort of define the street edge, but also again, to create more pedestrian interest along the sidewalk. And then we have frontage requirements. This is for commercial frontages. It defines the sidewalk width, the street tree placement, landscape requirements, all of that. This is for a residential frontage. Again, allows more landscaping, somewhat reduced sidewalk, but again, a pretty decent sidewalk and streetscape. And then, as I mentioned, again, we don't want a lot of blank walls in our commercial districts. So there's a minimum requirement for glazing so that the buildings have some transparency and interest for pedestrians. And one more, in terms of regulations, we retain the same open space requirements that you have for multifamily projects, but because these are probably going to be a little more urban, so to speak, being in the downtown proper, we have proposed requirements that would allow some of that open space to be private and some of it to be shared. So that's the only change in terms of open space. And with that, I'm going to turn the recommendations over to the redeveloper.
You want to push the next, let me, gonna make me figure this out myself. I see how this works. Okay, so tonight we're asking that the council hold a public hearing and consider all the testimony, waive the first reading of the ordinance and read by title only, and approve the ordinance as is or make edits to address matters, including but not limited to the time for rezoning of Site H or any other way in which you wish to amend the ordinance. And now we are available for any questions.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions for staff? Go ahead, Councilman Wellner.
So if this is the entirety of the presentation, so any questions about the timing, for example, with H and all that, are now what we're talking about, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, so a couple of questions for the Reed School site. What are the, to use your terminology, what are the odds for that site?
So we don't currently have odds for that site in the same way as we have odds for this. We didn't do anything for Hillside multifamily development. However, there are objectives, there are standards within the code that we can rely on for that site. If you remember, not too long ago, we did what we call the stopgap resolution. And that will help us apply those standards to that
Okay,
site.
so we can't use our Hillside ordinance because that talks about the character of
It's a
the,
guideline. We don't have. an
those are
ordinance
guidelines, can't use
guidelines.
those. But the ones that were specified when we passed the odds resolution are the ones that would apply to
When we
the
pass
Reed
the
School area.
stopgap resolution,
yeah.
yes, that would apply. Those are already within our ordinance today.
Okay, and in your view, is that sufficient, or do we need to proceed with a more detailed set of odds for the Reed School site at some point?
I believe that we need to set some better and more forceful standards that actually relate to hillside development for residential, so that we aren't looking at being too subjective or put in a place such as that. That would be my recommendation to the council, that we proceed as we have begun to talk about a scope of work and how we move forward with standards, excuse me, for hillsides.
Okay, so in the ordinance that we have in front of us tonight, the zoning for the Reed School site doesn't contain new objective standards, but is something that is a step you're suggesting that we should take going forward for that site.
That's correct. So I would lump it into the residential multifamily hillside development. That's how we would apply the odds that we would bring forward to you.
Okay, and would the Reed site and site H be the only two sites affected by that new category?
At this time, yes, but I think the way in which I would approach it is that we look at it as hillside development and try to address the concerns that might come up when you're looking at hillside development, such as massing and site layout and views that, as you're moving up and down a site. So we could apply that to any residential hillside development. But in short, yes, at this time, it would only pertain to those two that we've indicated. But there might be others in the future that we are not aware of that we would apply those same standards to.
Okay. And so the odds that would then, that you're saying we would look at and presumably approve for the Reed School site and for the site H, those are currently in the process of development, or is that something that we need to ask you to develop?
So we have begun discussion with our consultants to develop a scope of work. It would be helpful, of course, to have direction tonight that we should go ahead and go forward and bring that back to you at the earliest point forward, because we're looking at time, obviously. It did take us some time to get through the process, and there is a public process that we do need to take. I would suggest we do go to design review and then we go to planning commission, then we come to you. I think for the odds for downtown, we had at least 6 meetings. So being that where we are in the process, I would suggest that we would love direction from the town council to proceed in that manner, because I do believe that should be the next step.
Okay, and then I'm gonna let other folks ask some questions, but one final question on this topic. So if we were to provide guidance tonight to create this hillside residential odds policy, how long would it take to produce that, given what you've said in terms of what's required?
I think we could get through the public process and drafting within 6 months.
6 months.
Well, so being that we believe that the public process needs to be a big part of this, which is design review, planning commission, town council, that's at least a 3-month process right there. And then we have to draft, and whether we like to admit it or not, we have to do lots of legal noticing, which doesn't happen. We have to have 3 weeks before this one. And it could be done quicker, but based on how long this last odds took, which was close to a year, I'm hoping 5 to 6 months.
Okay, so then let me direct a question to town council. During the period from now until when we adopt site-specific odds for parcel H and for the Reed School site, we just have the stopgap odds in effect, but there's essentially very little restriction on what can be built at those sites. Is that correct?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Councilmember Wellner. So you're correct. So where you haven't adopted specific objective design and development standards, we would apply the ones that you adopted in your stopgap resolution, essentially carving out from your existing regulations what is objective, and whatever setbacks, height limits apply in the particular zoning district. But there would not be, hillside site specific newly developed objective standards to apply. So your density would be what it is, it's established in the district, et cetera. But you would not have these type of specific regulations that you're considering tonight for the downtown area.
And any particular odds that exist for those sites that would get in the way of achieving the density that's been put into the housing element for those sites would not be applicable. Is that?
You cannot utilize the standards to
Prevent.
reduce the density or deny the project. But we would look at other feasible alternatives. There are provisions in the Housing Accountability Act that allow you to deny a project or reduce density based on very specific findings that would have to be made. So it's not as though you couldn't do that, but it is a pretty high bar.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Vice Mayor Fredericks.
So let me run by some questions about ADUs. So right now, with respect to ADUs, we can't enforce the standards that deal with view blockage. The ones that we have now. Is there an objective standard for view blockage? It
Is
is,
it at an ADU?
yeah. It is a complaint that often came up with ADU applications.
Generally, it's a ministerial process, so I don't have that capability.
All right. Thank you. And then let me ask another question. What is the downside of a delay in approving the proposed zoning? And how long do you think this would take if it goes along as expeditiously as possible, considering the fact that HCD can take 60 days for each to review each submission?
So Vice Mayor Fredericks, if I understand your question correctly, if the town council were tonight to say, for example, we're gonna consider site H zoning, the R310 zoning at a later date, when we would bring forward these objective design and development standards, what's the downside to waiting? So as you well know, and we've talked about this many times, and we talked about it at the Planning Commission, the statutory deadline to adopt any rezonings to meet the to ensure that you have adequate sites and capacity to meet your RENA, because we missed the earlier adoption deadline, would be January 31, 2024. So that's an outside date, if you will.
And if you don't meet that,
It-
what happens?
Right. So, and if you don't meet that, there are various implications that would apply, and I can look those up for you specifically. But I thought what you were asking me is if you don't adopt it tonight, or introduce it tonight, what happens in this time period between now and say adopting in January? And one thing to consider, although I don't think it's just a reality, is that when you adopted your housing element and you designated a particular density for certain sites, including site H, your general plan now allows for that density, and the Housing Accountability Act indicates that if a project came forward at that proposed density that met your housing element, you could not deny it on the basis that your zoning is different, that the project is inconsistent with your zoning. So you're left in an interesting place where you have a project proposed at a density allowed under your general plan, but for lack of a better word, your zoning hasn't caught up. So you don't have these provisions in place for setbacks and height. We would look to what the current zoning designation is and utilize those provisions with the proviso that, as we just discussed, you can't apply standards that would have the effect of reducing the density or preventing the development of the project, absent making the very specific findings set forth in the Housing Accountability Act. So we talked about this at the Planning Commission. There is some benefit to having those provisions in place. Your community development director can indicate what currently would exist in terms of, the R310 zoning if you were to move forward with its adoption now. But that, I think, is one issue that we would have to deal with if a project came forward in between the time when you adopted the housing element and you adopt the zoning.
All right, so that doesn't quite address my question. My question was twofold. One is, what if we don't adopt by the deadline? Are there additional penalties from the state besides the fact that any submitted application would have to be judged under current zoning? And the other is, given what the turnaround is for successive submissions, how many times can we resubmit before we hit the deadline, given that there are 60 days for HCD to review each submission?
Let me
We
just
have to
ask
get it together. Yeah, go
a
ahead.
clarifying question. I think there are two different things here. Are you asking how long it takes HCD to approve zoning changes? Because they don't look at zoning, right? They only look at housing element.
No,
So you're saying if we submitted a new housing element proposal?
they don't look at. I was thinking about I was thinking specific, there was the zoning question. What happens if we don't rezone by January
Right.
31st, 2024? The second question was if we decide that we would like to look at the feasibility of ADUs, knowing that it takes 60 days, or they have the option of taking 60 days for HCD to review, what is a realistic timeline that we would have to look at and allow for it to bounce back and forth more than once?
So,
So in other words, if we were to do what's been, many of the letters have come in and said, we should postpone the zoning to H and at the same time look at revising the housing element again.
Yeah.
So presumably HCD will come back now and they may or may not approve the one we currently have, but let's say they approve it. If we were to amend it, we would have to resubmit to HCD and presumably it would take them another 60 days to
days.
respond. Is that?
And
That
and
is
that was
correct.
just their response,
just
not
once,
not
right.
necessarily their
so,
approval.
so the only thing is, and I know there's been a lot of letters with respect to ADUs and one of the things that we have to, the way in which HCD looks at ADUs is they look at 3 years and what you've done for the last 3 years. When we looked at our numbers, we actually haven't really produced that many in the last 3 years. And we're currently on track to approve about 9, which looks pretty good. And we've said we're going to develop 72 ADUs. So that number kind of makes sense, right? And actually, we were pretty liberal in that we looked at what our trend was and we raised it by 50% when we brought it to HCD. They didn't pause on that too much. We had to kind of support that throughout our discussions with them. There have been other jurisdictions, such as our neighbor across the street, who have used a great deal of ADUs to meet their RHNA numbers. HCD has not accepted that. They went out and they did a survey. And then they came back and they said, let me see, what was their response? The element presents confounding information on its ADU trends and assumptions. The element references 41 residential owners expressing their intentions in developing ADUs in the planning period and includes a realistic capacity determination of 30 of these units for inclusion in the site's inventory. However, the element must include substantial evidence to support this conclusion, especially considering even the most favorable recent trends would result in significantly lesser number of ADUs in the planning period. Then they went on to say, if you're going to do this, you're going to have to give us how you did your survey, what the questions were, who the people were, what the parcel listing is, the map of the identified sites, and perhaps go back and do another AFFH analysis, and look at environmental and other constraints, including infrastructure, size of sites, non-vacant sites, calculation of a realistic residential capacity, and appropriate zoning to accommodate housing for lower income households. And seeing as how most of these ADUs for us would be in a moderate to above moderate, it's going to be a difficult push. I'm not saying it's impossible, and I'm not saying that we couldn't go out and do that. I'm just not sure how HCD would respond to that based on how they look at it. They look at it based on what have you been doing for us lately in the last 3 years? What are you doing now and how can you push it? And if the council remembers, we kind of pushed the envelope a little bit on ADUs and SB9. We got a lot of pushback on both of those and we looked at them again in order to further analyze them. So we're happy to look at them again. I'm just wondering whether or not, I'm not wondering, I'm looking at how HCD evaluates this. I'm not sure this is going to get us to the numbers that we need to, that they would accept.
All right, but back to what I'm trying to get at. I was trying to think of if we approve the rezoning for site H now, and then as John mentioned, go back and try to amend our zoning to incorporate more ADUs after we do a survey. I can see one problem with that is, and this is a question for the lawyer, if the property owner of site H has taken any steps based on the zoning that we approve now to submit an application would that make it more difficult for us to amend the zoning to include ADUs and reduce the number of units on site age?
So you'd be amending the housing element first, right? Not the zoning. But just to be clear, that project could come in today.
It doesn't need the rezoning to
The
go.
rezoning doesn't facilitate that project.
Okay,
If I believe another question, or I think what part of your question is, and correct me if I'm wrong. If you were to adopt the zoning, introduce the zoning tonight, adopt it at your next meeting, goes into effect at the end of July. If HCD comes back which we're also expecting to hear from them by the end of July, and says, for example, we don't think that the development capacity you assigned to this site is realistic, look for some other sites. You would have the opportunity to go back and look at the zoning and potentially modify it. That takes another, process to go through that whole cycle to introduce, have planning commission make a recommendation as they would on the housing element and go forward with those modifications. So, you're in an interesting time where you have an adopted housing element, you're considering the proposed zoning to meet your RENA capacity, and we haven't quite, gotten to the finish line with HCD. So there would be some moving pieces if HCD came back and said, we want you to look at some other sites to accommodate these 93 above mod units.
all right, but where I was going was if we delay the zoning in order to do what the public has suggested, look at the actual feasibility of more ADU sites.
Mhm.
What is the consequence of that? And if it takes a really long time and now it's January 31st, 2024, and we haven't done the zoning, what are the possible consequences of that?
One possible consequence is that you would have to approve projects by right that are identified for rezoning in your housing element.
Sorry, the way you said that.
You couldn't apply.
You apply, you would, if we missed the deadline at the end of January, we would have to accept qualifying projects by right without any discretion.
Correct.
But what did you say about?
If you have identified projects, programs for rezoning of sites, and you haven't done that by January 31,
Right.
2024, there's a statutory provision that says you can't apply, you can't go through a discretionary process for applications for sites under that proposed zoning, the zoning that you have not yet implemented.
That's the same as before the 31st, though.
No, those are not necessarily by right. You could have a discretionary hearing. You can only apply objective design and development standards to it. But you can't have a conditional use permit or other types of discretionary permits. It's a process.
So are
It's
you
more of a
saying that
process
objective
question.
standards wouldn't
The
apply?
objective design and development standards would apply.
So the objective design and standards that are in place would apply before and after January 31st.
Correct.
And the presumably you can have a hearing to apply those objective design standards before or after July 31st. So the question is, what's the difference?
So right now, other than an SB 35 project or an AB 2011 project or if there's any other statutory provision that allows only for by right projects, you would go through a public hearing process before the planning commission, and they would go through the process of considering that application. They would only apply objective design and development standards to that application. The difference after January 31, 2024, if you haven't adopted your zoning, is you would not go through that discretionary process. You wouldn't have those public hearings in front of the planning commission.
Okay, what's confusing about what you're saying is you're calling it a discretionary process.
Yeah.
It's not discretionary before January 31st either.
Well, I'm using the language in the statute. I mean, that's what they call it. They indicate that you cannot apply, you cannot have that type of process, whether you want to call it discretionary or not. You cannot go through a CUP process or other type of process that you might normally do.
So can you clarify something? Because I thought I understood, but now I'm not sure. When is CEQA analysis available? It's not available under by right projects, is that right? Okay, and then discretionary is another standard. Does that include the prohibition against a CEQA analysis? It's just not using subjective standards, but CEQA is not considered an objective standard.
CEQA is not considered an objective standard, and, CEQA does not apply to ministerial projects.
Yeah.
Whether or not, and the statute is silent on that provision, this provision of the statute that I'm referring to about the implication for not having your zoning in place by the statutory deadline is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's silent about CEQA. We'd have to look to other provisions to determine how that would apply.
All right, I thank you. I'm still not clear on what the consequences of delaying zoning is.
Like, what is the discretion by you? Like, what, do you have an example of what the difference is between?
And you're not, that's not what he's asking. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I was hearing too many.
Well, it's just my way of rephrasing what they've been asking in terms of like, what, you say there's a discretionary process, but given all the constraints around that, like, what is the different, can you give me an example of a project that would be positively benefited through the discretionary process that we wouldn't otherwise achieve without the discretionary process?
So let me back up. Let me tell you what the statute says, and then let's see if that helps. And if it doesn't, then let's maybe try and parse it out. So what this provision says is if the local government fails to complete the rezoning by the deadline provided in this other statutory section. So if you don't do your rezonings on time, you may not disapprove a housing development project, nor require a conditional use permit, planned unit development permit, or other locally imposed discretionary permit, or impose a condition that would render the project infeasible if it's proposed to be located on a site to be rezoned pursuant to the programs that you have in your housing element. So what the statute is saying, and what you could do under the HAA right now for a housing development project that doesn't fall within one of the buckets of, SB 35 or other ministerial processes. You would go through a process to have hearings in front of the Planning Commission to issue whatever types of permits are required. The Planning Commission would be limited to applying objective design and development standards, and you cannot utilize those standards to render the project infeasible or to reduce its density or deny it. So if you don't adopt your zoning by the statutory deadline, which we do not recommend, by the way, we recommend that you have your zoning in place to implement your housing element within the statutory deadline. You can't go through those processes. That's what the statute is saying. You can't require a conditional use permit or whatever other non-ministerial permits that your zoning ordinance may otherwise require.
Okay, but before January 31st, can you require a conditional use permit? You can't, because
You can, you just cannot condition it. You cannot have subjective conditions. You can have objective conditions to implement your objective standards. And you cannot use those conditions to reduce the density or deny the project unless you make the statutory findings.
But you can reduce the density?
no.
No,
You cannot.
I'm trying to figure out the difference between complying with the statutory deadline and not complying with the statutory deadline for rezoning.
Happy to have another voice saying exactly what Ms. Wagner's saying, is that you can't have a discretionary process, even if that discretion is limited in some respect. If you have a permit that's required, like a CUP, we can't even impose that and have a process to impose a CUP to come up with conditions of approval. And yes, those conditions have to be objective. A lot of our CUPs have objective conditions right now in our operations downtown: noise, hours of operation, things that are objective qualifications, we would not be able to have that for those projects.
I got it. Thank you.
Although I thought what I heard was that those projects have to comply with odds also. So if you're saying before January 31st of next year, if you adopt zoning on time, then you could have a hearing to impose the odds, but they still have to comply with the odds, even if you don't have a hearing after January 31st, if you miss your zoning deadline. Because they have to comply with odds either way.
They have to comply with odds, but the unknown is, what if we have a requirement for a CUP? How do we impose odds on a project after January 31st when we don't have a right to have a discretionary hearing to have that vehicle in our code of a CUP? So it's a little unclear how that would logistically be approved by ministerial action at that point after January 31st.
Presumably, if you
which
can
is
have a
why-
hearing, they would submit a project to our planning department. Planning department would send a letter back saying you missed these 5 odds, we can't approve it ministerially. But the holding of a hearing doesn't really make a substantive difference, as far as I can tell.
Well, I mean, imagine you were on the planning commission, so all those hearings you sat through where you had public testimony of things that they wanted as objective factors too, right? Objective things that they were requesting and be part of that process. You had the ability to listen to that testimony and craft it into a condition of approval that was either subjective in certain cases or objective. So you would still have that ability, if you have your zoning in place, to have those hearings and impose conditions of approval that are objective.
But the whole point of the objective standards is that the developer knows, even before they start, what the requirements are. And the entity that's reviewing the project can't add something that's not already in the objective standards and can't add anything subjective. So it's not like if you're doing it before January 31st, you could add something that isn't already an objective standard. I mean, they're all listed. That's the whole point. So I mean, we probably should move on, but I think we don't have a very clear understanding of what the penalty is for postponing zoning beyond January 31st, at least I don't.
I don't either. But assuming that they can do anything they would like to us. I have just one more question. Is it possible to just zone site H now, do the ADU survey, and then amend the density of site H? That
Well, I think there's
question
a known net
includes
loss problem.
how long it takes going through HCD again.
The likelihood of HCD producing a number, I think, is very low.
It's hard to know with HCD, honestly. But I would agree with Councilmember Wellner that once they see a density and they look at the numbers, they're pretty set. And I think, exercise can't hurt to look at the ADUs. I'm just not really convinced that they're going to take those ADUs and reduce another density. But I could be completely wrong.
What
because
is the number of
HCD
ADUs we're currently predicting?
72.
So we're predicting that over the next 3 years, we'll have 72 ADUs. And what's being proposed in the letters that we've received is that somehow through a survey, we would be able to convince HCD that we're going to get substantially more than that number,
Twice
to the
that number.
tune of something like 90 more.
That's correct. And as you remember, we got a little bit of pushback for some of our analysis before.
Sure. And what is the number of SB9 units we're counting?
Oh,
I think that was another
Well,
pushback item.
how many was that? I think it went down. Remember, we had done a
You guys
really,
went down to 0 and we went up to 25% or something?
right, exactly. It came out, I think there's like, I want to say 80, but
Something like that.
yeah, something like that. I should know those numbers by heart by now, but
So
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No.
I just have I have a question that I want to ask because I think it illuminates something about the letters we've received. So We received a lot of letters urging us to delay the zoning of parcel H. And I guess what doesn't seem to be clear, at least with, the idea is that somehow by delaying the zoning, you would delay the project. And what I understand is that delaying the zoning doesn't delay the project unless the project proponent decides to wait for the zoning, but they could file something tomorrow, as you said. So I'm not sure, other than waiting for odds to be developed and then approving those, I don't see delaying zoning having the impact that the advocates of delaying zoning want it to have. Am I getting that wrong, or is that correct?
You're correct. So a project could be submitted tomorrow and under the provision of the Housing Accountability Act that we've been talking about, because if it meets the density identified in the housing element, you can't deny that project because your zoning is inconsistent. And I say it that way because that's the reality of it, and that you can still deny a project if you can make the findings that the Housing Accountability Act includes, but you can't deny it on the basis that your zoning is inconsistent with the density identified in the general plan.
And so the most important thing that we can do to constrain development on parcel H would be to quickly develop odds and approve them, because that would at least create some parameters that anyone who's building on parcel H would have to adhere to. Is that correct?
If the town wants to impose additional objective design and development standards to apply to the R3 zone, that's correct.
Okay, one last question, then I'll cede some time, but if a project is submitted and we later adopt a set of objective housing standards or objective standards before that project is approved, can we apply those objective standards to the project?
If a preliminary application is submitted, you can only apply the objective standards in place at the time the complete application is submitted.
Okay, that sounds like the builder's remedy, but this is one where we already have our housing element.
It's the same thing. It's a preliminary application, locks in your objective standards.
Locks in your objective standards even after we adopt a sufficient housing element.
Yes.
Okay.
Let me switch gears a little bit before we all ground. There is an upside to the zoning on site H, I think, and that is that it's proposed for market rate housing mostly, isn't that right?
It's all above moderate on site H.
And so is that kind of a project, the kind that generates inclusionary housing fees that would, and if so, can those fees be used to subsidize required affordable housing elsewhere in town?
Your inclusionary housing ordinance would apply to a project submitted on that site, correct? And utilization of the funds, I would have to defer to your community development director. So Vice Mayor Fredericks, we'd have to pull up your inclusionary housing ordinance to indicate, if a fee is paid, how can those funds be used? But they would be used for low and moderate income housing.
And I guess the question would be here in town or, yes.
Yes, in town.
And pull it out. And then clarify again, HCD has already seen the proposed zoning in the housing element of site H. Have they already seen?
They're reviewing the program. I'm sorry, I apologize, Vice Mayor
No,
Fredericks.
no, you're answering. Go
They're
ahead.
currently reviewing the programs that are identified in the housing element that you submitted, which includes the rezoning for site H. They don't actually, I don't believe we'll be looking at the zoning itself, but the program that's included to change the zoning for site H to the R310 is included in the housing element that they're reviewing.
And the fact that they're reviewing it now, will that, and you'll have to guess at this based on experience, will that have any impact on their likelihood to accept our rezoning it to reduce density and backfill with ADUs?
So if, for example, HCD had approved your current housing element and certified it, if the town later wanted to modify it to add additional sites or add additional ways in which to meet the portion of the arena that's being met by site H currently, you'd have to resubmit that to them. And I'm not sure how they would react to it. It would depend on what the sites are and if they meet the same need that site H is meeting.
Well, I was really focused on the process that is requested of us now, which is in the zoning we're doing to delay it and substitute ADUs. Given how would HCD respond to that, given that we have a housing element that refers to site H's zoning?
So I would defer to your
density.
community development director and potentially your housing element consultant if she's available on what their experience is with HCD and how
Yeah.
they're dealing with those types of modifications.
You're going to try to get Christine. We have Christine on the line, but so we can ask that question directly. And just an answer to you, I was trying to get our website up on my phone. So Bob, help me. It's 15% inclusionary in our inclusionary housing.
Oh, back to inclusionary. And the second question that I think Mary referred to you goes to Christine, is that it?
So she can answer more of the questions with respect to HCD and how they might look at that question that you gave.
So I think the question is about going back to HCD, revising the density on site H and then backfilling with ADUs. The ADUs were accepted by HCD because we really did approach it and calculate the capacity using their guidelines. And we did do it kind of at the upper limit because we based it on those 3 years of development, the production that the town had demonstrated. And then we increased it by 50%. So they didn't question the numbers. I think if we went back and we tried to use a survey similar to what Belvedere did, Ross is trying to do the same thing, we would get a lot of pushback from HCD. And, all of those requirements that Dina had read off earlier is really just a way, because HCD doesn't just deny something and say, no, you can't use it. What they do is they put up a long list of hoops that you have jumped through in order to demonstrate to them. And then they'll just keep coming back and saying you haven't demonstrated it. So I think that's what would happen, is my guess, if we would try to go back and use the ADUs. But I don't know. I've never actually tried to do that before. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering if they would be more likely to criticize. We already know that staff thinks they'd be more likely to criticize additional ADU offers based on how they looked at the ADUs that we submitted previously. But I was just wondering whether it would produce even more pushback because they have already seen in our housing element the density we were proposing for site H.
One of the things that will happen is that, we're on this track with HCD. We resubmitted the third draft to them, the adopted housing element, which they're going to consider as a third draft. And the issues that we get back generally just stay on the ones that they brought up previously. They don't reopen the entire element to a review. They just look at the issues that they had brought up and did we address those? I think if we go back and we say we're going to now open up ADUs again, I think that makes us vulnerable to looking at everything all over again.
I agree with you, Christine. I would say though, and I'm gonna make this a statement, but it's really a question. That is, isn't it true that in the second set of comments we got from HCD, they opened a whole bunch of new issues that hadn't been in the first set of comments? Right, so I mean, I'm not saying that it's a wise thing to reopen issues for them to look at, but I'm just saying that it wasn't like they submitted comments the first time around, we submitted something in response, and then they limited their comments to what they had raised before. They raised new issues as if someone new was reading it, really. Anyway.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, I think that's,
I think they wanted further clarification on the sites. Are there actually leases? What that are in effect and will render that site infeasible? What is the status of the master plan at the Reach School? And is that site now still feasible? So I kind of felt like there were additional questions, but yes, I mean, they can certainly ask anything and require any additional information that they want.
I have a slightly different question for council, and that is, if HCD comes back and says they don't like our current plan, but we've adopted it and asserted that we believe it's sufficient, what's our legal status at that point?
It would likely depend on how they frame their letter. But we would take the position that we adopted a compliant housing element. And if we need to make amendments based on something they point out that they think doesn't comply with the housing law, rather than just more information, we would have to evaluate whether we need to amend our adoption.
Okay.
So can I ask a question? The planning commission made a recommendation that we wait on the zoning. And do you know, like, I can see a couple of reasons why, and I watched the meeting twice and I thought I understood it until tonight. But like, I could see waiting until HCD fully accepts site H. And if they ask us to reduce that, then we could hopefully backfill with ADUs. I agree, maybe that the ADUs in and of themselves aren't a replacement strategy without HCD action. Or was it that there's not, or did they want us to wait for odds? Like, downtown, I feel like we have odds we can adopt and zoning we can implement at the same time, and sort of that consistency package resonates as being sort of virtuous, whereas there's a little less certainty here. So when the planning commission made the recommendation that we wait, like, what was the essence of the recommendation?
so I think you're hitting on parts of what that essence was, which is they questioned about the odds. They questioned about whether or not we should have those in place first. So that was part of the delay. I think there was at least one commissioner who was not in favor of the site in general. So that was another reason. I also think that it was a way in which we could look at some of the issues that the public had brought up. And so it would allow us time either to wait until certification or until January 31st, 2024. And they opted for sort of moving us and giving us some space there to do some of that work.
Well,
was the general
waiting for
plan.
certification seems like it could make sense, in the sense that if we rezone tonight and parcel H is thrown out, I don't think it will be, but if it's thrown out from the housing element by HCD, then we would have zoned parcel H in a way that would allow development that doesn't help us with regard to our meeting our housing element parts, right? So it probably makes sense, unless you can explain to me why it doesn't, it probably makes sense to at least wait until we know how HCD feels about parcel H, not to open it up for development prior to knowing whether it will count.
Well, just to be clear, it's open for development now under certain circumstances.
Yes.
But I don't disagree that there's not a huge downside to waiting, if that's your question.
Right.
I
And
want
so
the
what is
council
the-
to understand.
Can we put a
that-
fine point on what the difference is between approving the zoning for H and not approving the zoning for H tonight? What's the specific objective standards we would be gaining or losing?
Well,
we
the
know?
objective standards that are contained in the zoning ordinance tonight, there are some, like, I'll defer to.
Minimum lot size, coverage would be in there, as well as building setbacks are within the zoning ordinance if it was adopted tonight for the R310.
And if it weren't adopted tonight, then basically we would be in a situation where there are no setbacks or coverage limits.
We would rely on what's currently in the code with what we call the stopgap. So we pulled those objective design standards, so we still could look at some of that.
And if I may, Councilmember Wellner, I think we would also look to its current zoning. Whatever our
standards.
however, staff is
Doesn't have
telling me.
There's very
There are
few
very few
standards
standards that
in the
apply
RPD.
in the RPD, so we would be relying primarily on the standards that have been identified in the resolution adopted by council as the objective standards that currently exist in your
Right.
regulations.
So I don't want to put you on the spot, and it's okay if the answer is we don't have it in front of us, but I guess what I'm trying to figure out is what is the difference between what's in the stopgap and what we would be adopting tonight in terms of coverage and setback?
Actually, it's the three things that you see in the R310, which have to do with, what did we say? We said minimum lot size, and the site coverage. and
Wait, let's back up.
setbacks.
So minimum lot size is set in the new zoning and it isn't set currently.
That's correct.
And minimum lot size, it's not maximum lot size, it's minimum lot size.
Right.
So it's saying that we would be adopting an objective standard for H that says that any individual unit would have to have some minimum amount of
What is
lot
it?
size. And what would that be?
And that would be 3,500 square feet
Okay, so
per
The li-
unit, per unit.
3,500 per unit.
Yes.
And so how does that compare with what's likely to be built if there were no standard? Do we know?
Like,
Is 3,500 a
Been a
lot or little
restriction.
or what, you know?
so RPD doesn't have that same restriction. So it's a plan development and we develop those standards
Okay.
currently.
All right. And so then what's the second one?
Lot coverage of 30% and then setbacks.
And what is the setback?
15 is at the front setback and 8 foot in the rear. Or side, let me make sure, side.
That's for unit or for the parcel? Because if it's for the parcel, it's just the edge of the parcel.
Minimum setbacks, so when you're talking about when you're developing a 3,500 square foot building, these are the setbacks you have to have from the parcel lines that they
From
made.
that, but from the parcel H lines.
Well, he's gonna, there will be some sort of subdivision from that, so, yeah. It won't be that all of them sit 8 foot from, Paradise Drive.
Okay. All right. So those are essentially the three objective standards that would be added and don't exist currently if we were to adopt zoning tonight versus leaving it the way it is.
That's correct.
Should we open it to the public?
Yes, let's do that. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for public comment. So anyone in chambers who wants to speak on this item, please come up, state your name, and you'll have 3 minutes and no more to speak.
My name is Jeffrey Shannon, and I don't think I could possibly unravel this in 3 minutes, but I'm going to try. First, there is a detriment, a distinct detriment to rezoning tonight. And that is because if you rezone tonight, you have to make a finding in order to do it, that the change in zoning is not detrimental to the public safety, health, and welfare. Without the zoning in place, if an application is filed today under these same standards that have been applied, the density applies, but you can still come back and make a finding that the project is not, it would be detrimental to the public safety, health, and welfare for even including its density. And those are the standards that she was talking about when she said there are definitive standards. I've set them forth in my letter. I don't have time to go through them all, but if you make the finding that's opposite that, you will be stopped from making it again. That's a principle of law. If you find it's not detrimental, and then you come along and you say, we think it is detrimental, we want to deny the project or lower the density on that basis, you won't be able to make those findings. That's really a disadvantage. There's no advantage to making these, to doing the zoning tonight when you don't have to do it until January 31 of 2024, and no one's proposing that you go beyond that. So let's talk about what happens now with HCD and ADUs. What we've been proposing with respect to the ADUs is different than what was done before. The 72 number was determined not by any going to anybody, but by a trend analysis, which HCD allows. It's a way you can do it without going to the individual sites. What we're proposing is that you do the equivalent of what was done for specific sites, which is to go to residents and get a written expression of interest. That means I'm going to make it available, just like Site H did. That's how Site H got here. It was a no net loss substitution that was done in January for the SB9 units when there were 93 missing. And what we're proposing is you do a no net loss substitution to correct that over the next 7 months. Leave your HCD element in place. If they approve it, great. If they don't, you would want to have these units to be able to propose. I don't know what kind of survey was done in these other jurisdictions, but I can tell you that there's a survey is only one way in which you can establish the numbers, and that's where the 72 came from. So yes, we need 93 more because there's already 72 in it, and that's why we would need 165 written expressions of interest from real parcel holders who say, I have a parcel, I'm interested in one JADU or one ADU, and I'm willing to do it over the next 8 years. And HCD will accept that. I believe they definitely will accept that. I'm going to start the campaign right now. I'll generate one of those. I will pledge to do it. If you don't rezone tonight, you can have my property for one ADU and JDU, and I'll put it in writing. And that's what we're saying. And I think that that's what they asked for in the SB9 units. Those were based on a projection too. And they came back and they said, wait, you have to go to the owners. And that's what they did. The staff did that in a 3-week period in January. And they found, well, we only have 6 owners who are willing to do it. And so they had to reduce the number.
Thank you, Mr. Chan.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Hello.
Hey, welcome.
Thank you. My name is Cesare Rotundo. I have to say, first of all, I don't have perfect clarity of what the situation is and what the rules are. If you have, that's great, right? But, you know, I think we're all in the same situation. But I think that, you know, I don't think that the state is forcing you to make rezoning decisions for sites that they know nothing about, especially if they have a special topography. We know the state just makes rules based on things that don't take topography into account. So, but one thing is for sure, as we have heard, if you rezone it, you paint yourself into a corner. You already are painted into a corner, quite frankly. I don't know why you submit an HCD with 93 units in Site H, but you know, that's where we are today. But you have to stop, I think, painting into a corner. And also think about the people that you're painting into a corner down there, right? If I was a resident down there, I want access to Tiburon, and so the traffic will be there. I come here and I want to walk in downtown, and Mr. Brown, you know, show the downtown with less parking lots and nice buildings. Yes, 3-story high, but nice buildings. You know, I would like to walk here every day, possibly, right? So even in terms of traffic, all this, you know, avoid the traffic downtown, don't have people living there. I don't think that, you know, that's the right assumption. So all in all, you know, again, the state is neglecting to do some things. It's your responsibility to take that into account. And, you know, I hope that you don't kick the can down to Corte Madera, because, you know, if I moved to Paradise Case because I love downtown Tiburon.
Thank you, Mr. Rotundo. Is there anyone else in the chambers who'd like to make a comment? Just out of curiosity, Madam Clerk, how many people do we have online with hands raised? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I take some spot.
No.
Hi, I'm Polly Cooper. I live on Paradise Drive. And I'm here just to reemphasize what we talked about at the Planning Commission, that we really hope that you do not rezone that piece of property. I used to ride my bike on Paradise Drive a lot, and I don't anymore just because it's too dangerous. And that particular part where Site H is there's no shoulder, there's no bike path, it's not walkable. When I came in a little late because I was working, but I saw the presentation of the walkable area downtown and how nice that is. And if you're talking about that density and not have walkability, not have public transportation, it's hair raising getting in and out of there. So I just want to emphasize that I'm sorry that you're up against the gun with timing. It's unfortunate, but it doesn't make that a good idea. I mean, it doesn't make it a good idea. It's a terrible idea. And I think it's the safety, it changes the whole character of the area. Where when you look at downtown, people can walk into town, you go to restaurants, it would make people want to come there. That side of Tiburon, it just creates more of a hazard. And I just want to make that, make my voice heard again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. If there's no one else in the chambers who wants to, go ahead, please. Good
Hi,
evening.
I'm Mary Ann Shannon. I only have a few things to say. I didn't bring a giant sheet, so I don't have to rush through. Thank you for taking my comments. I didn't think I would talk tonight, but because I've written a lot of letters. Okay, so one thing that I just want to bring up, or three things. One is that with the general plan and the EIR, we're always talking about the big level, the high level. We're never talking about any specific site. But now we are looking at a specific site, and here is where the rubber meets the road, literally, right? And another thing, and so I think that that's important to be able to think about it in that way, that we're not just thinking about it this high level, which Commissioner DeFever brought up also. I also wanted to bring up the point about the Inclusionary Act. And I personally, I'm thinking about the environment around that area, all of the wildlife and the birds and otters and everything. And I don't think any amount of money is enough to warrant paying a developer paying to destroy the environment of that area, which leads into the salt marsh. And about the ADUs, it looks like Dina was saying that with all of the feedback from the other jurisdictions, that you have a really good template right now to do conduct an ADU survey, because you know what HCD is looking for and you know what they're not looking for. So I don't, it sounds like there is a good template already, and I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Jeannie Rizzo. I live on Paradise Drive, and I work for the state of California, so I feel your pain. I understand when you have multiple statutes that you're trying to adjudicate. I work in an area that deals with environmental hazards, and I while there's a programmatic EIR, I really don't think that H will survive a real EIR, a full EIR, nor manage its way through CEQA. I said that before, and I think it's something that really would benefit by consultant advice on that. Right, on environmental consultants looking at Site H with that in mind. Would it survive that? Could it do it? And we're talking about not dealing with inclusionary housing on Site H, whereas ADUs will be more moderate. We've considered it for the local teacher, for the worker. ADUs work for that. Site H is not intended for that. So you won't accomplish any social justice issue that was in the design when SB 9 was passed. So I just want to say, you're juggling a lot. I get it, but H is really going to be fraught. We're going to be here for years talking about H. So I just thank you for reconsidering.
Thank you. Good evening.
My name's Stacy Escarte, and I live down in Paradise K. I've written you guys multiple letters. I'm not sure if you received the one today. I sent it a little later this afternoon. I think there's several issues with site H. There's road safety issues, as was mentioned before. Bicyclist is dying, period. That road is incredibly dangerous and there's there's no sidewalks, there's no infrastructure. The location's isolated, as this gentleman mentioned, and you have a lot of requirements for downtown that you mentioned this evening that seem to be completely disregarded down there. Pedestrian orientation, walkability, alternative modes, minimizing parking, view blockage with ADUs is a concern. Doesn't seem to be a concern down there. I think an EIR report, CEQA compliance is going to be really, really difficult. You've got the Coastal Commission, you've got baykeepers, you've got drainage from this hillside. It's fraught with so many issues, noise pollution, light pollution, water pollution, I mean, you name it. And I just think that also, I want to say for the record, and I didn't put this in my letter, but I think it was extremely underhanded that the city adopted that property in 2021 when everybody was coming out of the pandemic and not paying attention. And as far as I can tell, as a property owner down there and in the neighborhood, we never received any notice that that property was being annexed to the city of Tiburon. And we've always been told to kind of mind our own business over there because we're part of the county. I think you're going to have police issues. I think you're going to have fire safety issues. We have trouble getting the sewage up the hill in the K. There's electrical issues down there. Every storm, we lose electricity. So good luck getting the infrastructure down there. I just think that the site is completely inconducive to 93 units of anything, whether it's low or moderate or market housing is kind of beside the point. It's just not conducive to 93 units at all. And I do think that it's surprising to me that the city could annex property that isn't even contiguous with city limits.
So at this point, I will take.
Foghorn.
Agree with Jeff's proposal to canvass the neighbors and the citizens, see we can find out. I think there's people that are willing, they're presented with that option, step forward. Jeff said what's that? Oh. You're saying my name? Is that what you're saying? Scott Miller. I'm Scott Miller. I live in Paradise Cay. So actually, Jeff, my son will move in if you build. What was that?
Ignore that, please.
Oh, it's online. Yeah. Paradise Drive has cliffs on both sides, and these pinch points prevent cars from pulling over to allow emergency vehicles to respond. Paradise Drive is a solid double yellow from end to end, and routine service vehicles, including school buses, mail trucks, garbage trucks, stop the daily flow of traffic. Not to mention emergent accidents with fire trucks, police cars, and ambulances, and these pinch points become life-threatening hazards. We have lived in Paradise Cay for over 20 years, and we have always forbidden our children from walking or riding on Paradise Cay. My wife and son were severely injured in a head-on accident, and we know firsthand of multiple accounts of accidents on Paradise Cay. Our neighbor Ken Royale was a firefighter EMT responder based out of the Trestle Glen Station for over 20 years, and he knows firsthand the difference between Tiburon Boulevard and Paradise Drive. Paradise Drive is already an underdeveloped rural road, and Tiburon leadership is now considering Site H that will make this road even more dangerous. This patchwork manipulation of zoning law to add 93 units is a clear-cut political appeasement devoid of safety review. The consideration of rezoning Site H is reminiscent of the catastrophic proposal to build Marincello, the development in the Marin Headlands that was stopped by a tidal wave of public outcry. The groundswell opposition to Marincello by Marin County environmentalists resulted in the birth of the Trust for Public Land, now headquartered in San Francisco with over 30 field offices, including Washington, D.C. So I am confident there's a better path forward, similar to what Jeff proposed here, and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Is there anyone else in the chamber who wants to speak? Okay, so at this point, I'll turn it over to anyone online who'd like to speak on Zoom.
We will start with Peter Prowse.
Thanks.
Good evening, council members. My name is Peter Prowse. I'm an attorney for the Committee to Preserve the Paradise Cove Salt Marsh, Highlands and Neighborhood Safety Group, which is a group comprised of concerned citizens who have spoken at all of the prior public hearings on this matter. I submitted a letter earlier today, which I hope made it into your packet. I agree with Mr. Shannon that the proposed rezoning of Site H tonight would have direct and immediate consequences. In my letter, I highlight CEQA as the big one. We didn't hear much or anything about CEQA from your council, but nothing in the Housing and Accountability Act exempts or excuses Tiburon or applicants from going through full CEQA processes.
So Mr. Prowse, I'm sorry to do this to you, but we lost our connection there. Could you start again from the beginning?
Certainly, and I'm sorry.
Oh, it's our bad.
I'll start again. Okay. My name is Peter Prowse. I'm an attorney for the Committee to Preserve the Paradise Cove Salt Marsh, Highlands and Neighborhood Safety Group, which is comprised of concerned citizens who have spoken at all of the prior public hearings on this matter. I submitted a letter earlier today, which I hope made it into your packet. I agree with Mr. Shannon that the rezoning, if approved tonight, would have immediate and direct consequences. And CEQA is the big one. Nothing in the Housing Accountability Act exempts or excuses Tiburon or project applicants from going through the full CEQA process. And this rezoning is a project subject to CEQA. Rezoning would require an immediate change in the use of the site, which, as I described in my letter, would require a project level site-specific EIR. The reason is that if you look at table 2-1 in the proposed rezoning ordinance, the proposed R3-10 zoning would make unlawful the current open space use of the site. It would be open space would be prohibited. And in fact, the only permitted by right use of the site for a private owner is dense residential development. So you'd be making unlawful today the current open space use of the site and requiring today the development of that site as dense residential use without any consideration or analysis of the environmental consequences. The dense residential development of that site would have all manner of unstudied environmental impacts, which my letter and many of the other comment letters provide substantial evidence in support of. This rezoning is a project. You need to do CEQA and an EIR is required. Thank you very much.
So sorry, we lost you at 1:41. We were just talking
We were talking about
About
the
table
EIR.
2-1 and how.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what's going on. I can hear you all and see you all just fine. 2-1 makes unlawful the current open space use of the site. And the only permitted use that the rezoning would allow for a private property owner like this one is dense residential development. That's a project under CEQA, making unlawful the current use and requiring a new, very different use. My letter and the others in the file provide substantial evidence of significant environmental impacts of this project. An EIR is required to go through with this rezoning tonight. Thank you.
Thank
Hope
you,
you got
Mr.
that.
Prowse. Appreciate your patience with us too. Please, there one more in the queue, at least.
Next is Beth Gassel.
Thanks.
Good evening. Hi, this is James Gassel with my wife Beth Gassel. We are residents of 4505 Paradise Drive. Thank you for your time this evening. I know this is a challenge for you. Can you hear me all right? My screen's frozen. Can you hear me? Darn it. It froze. All right, let's leave and come back again.
Yeah, fiber here.
Yeah.
Looks like he dropped off. So I'm going to recognize Julie Jacobs.
Thank you.
Looks like we're frozen again. Oh, where's your name?
Good evening. I'm Julie Jacobs, and I would like to thank Town Council for your courage in leading our town to avoid the exposure to the builder's remedy applications, taking the tough steps to comply with state law. I understand that all of the sites under consideration for development to meet the allocation, the RENA allocation, have issues associated with them. They all have safety issues. They all have environmental issues. They all have traffic issues. And I'm concerned that if we proceed in a piecemeal fashion with rezoning to accompany the housing element, we may give the message to HCD that we're not sincere in our efforts to comply with state law. I think we should proceed and do as we must to meet our requirements and do our best to minimize the risks. I think we should try to get public transportation out to any site that is available under the housing element. And we should work together as the wonderful town that Tiburon is to move forward and meet our requirements. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Hey, sorry to cut you off there. Welcome back.
Thank you. Hi, this is James Gassel. Should I pick it up again?
Yeah, please start from the top, actually. Thanks.
You bet. Thank you, guys. Appreciate everyone's time this evening. And I know this is a very difficult issue to manage through. Again, this is James Gassel with my wife, Beth Gassel. We live at 4505 Paradise Drive. In fact, directly across from Site H. So want to reiterate our support for the delaying of the rezoning while we explore the ADU strategy and trying to comply with that and see if that can resolve the issue for the housing element. My wife and I would also be more than happy to sign on the dotted line as it relates to our commitment to a junior ADU and an ADU on our property. We do believe that we have an aggressive group of folks who are willing to participate in getting the numbers we need for an ADU strategy to resolve the housing element overall. And with that, I'd like to give the next 2 minutes to Jeff Channon to expand on our approach as it relates to this issue. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that, but we can't do that.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay,
he's
I
doing it
tried.
extensively, so we've read his letters.
Okay, very good. Well, just know that there are many of us who are committed to the ADU approach. And it feels like there is no downside to the delaying of this rezoning, waiting till at least the deadline of January 31st of 24, giving us more time to see if we can accomplish the town's need, as well as our own desires to fulfill on the commitments to the state. So thank you very much. Nothing more to add on that.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Do you see anyone else?
Seeing nothing further.
Okay, so I'll close public comment period at this time and bring it back to the council for deliberations. Want to start us off? Councilman?
Yeah, I have a question to start actually for town council. One of the speakers referred to the CEQA process and environmental analysis of parcel H. It's my understanding that the environmental analysis for the housing element that included parcel H included parcel H as part of the analysis. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so we have an EIR that includes parcel H, and there's no new EIR required for the zoning. Is that correct?
The program EIR that was adopted included analysis of site H, and there's no need for another additional EIR.
Okay, all right. Okay, so just pull up my notes. So we're obviously in a difficult juncture here. And I guess I'd like to start by, we had a longer discussion about this at our last meeting, but I just want to start by resetting what we're talking about here, which is these are state requirements. Nobody thinks it's a good idea, at least in this room, as far as I can tell, to add 639 units to our city. It's an increase over the next 8 years. It's an astonishing increase of 16% of the housing units that exist in an area that is essentially built out and has a lot of obstacles and constraints, including environmental ones that really indicate that that kind of housing growth is inappropriate for here. However, we've been forced to go down this path by the state, and as council members for the entire peninsula, we have to take into consideration, of course, all of the available sites and the impacts on the entire town of each site. So I can say, I'll let the other council members speak for themselves. I don't think the development at parcel H is a good idea. I don't think the development downtown is a good idea. I think that the level of development that's being essentially crammed into Tiburon is dangerous and doesn't make sense. But here we are. So there are 3 points I'd like to make, or three, and these actually are proposals for the resolution as well as points. I think that the ADU proposal is worth trying. I think it's a citizen initiative that perhaps with citizen help, the town will be able to do it more effectively than it ever could on its own. I think everyone would recognize that if the town 6 months ago had sent out a flyer to houses and said, who wants to build an ADU, the response would have been nothing. And in fact, I think that's what we did. But now that there is kind of a grassroots groundswell of interest in, perhaps doing this, I think one thing I'd like to do as part of our resolution tonight is, and I guess I'll leave it to council about whether this should be in the resolution or it's just a separate direction from the council. But I think I'd like our community development department to work with the citizen groups to attempt to identify 175 ADU sites. And if we start this process and we get 23, that's what we got. If we start this process and there's a flood of interest, that would be fantastic. So I don't think that we have to stand on any principle to say, no, we won't consider it. It's just it's a heavy lift, but I think it's worth trying. Secondly, I think we need odds for site H and the Reed site, and we need them yesterday. I know that there's been a lot on everyone's plate. I'm sorry that we don't have those ready now. I would strongly urge staff to identify the quickest time frame possible for getting that done. I certainly hope it's not 6 months. I'd like it to be something like 2 months. I don't think this is the same kind of effort as the one downtown. I think it's probably simpler, and I think that there's a lot of public interest. So the need for multiple meetings is probably not there, because one meeting will be, I'm sure, packed with half the town in it. But what I would say about it is, I think it might make the job easier. You tell me. I think it might make the job easier to view it as odds for site H and for the Reed site, and not odds for all hillside development in general. I think it's a harder task to try and come up with, rules for every conceivable site. And maybe if we just even focused on site H, I just think developing some odds that will put parameters around what happens there is extremely important, and we need as soon as possible. And then I guess the last point is about whether to adopt the zoning. I don't think there's any question that we should adopt the zoning for downtown tonight and the odds. I haven't heard anyone suggest otherwise. And it makes sense because the odds will immediately put limits on what happens downtown if a proposal comes in. With regard to site H, I don't think that delaying the approval of the zoning will do what the proponents of delaying the zoning think it will do. I think it won't prevent really anything. I'm willing to do it though, until the odds are ready. Because I think that changing the zoning for site H, given what we heard tonight, provides 3 objective standards of very limited utility. So I don't see that there's really a need to adopt it until we have odds that are worth adopting and that will actually help. So I guess my thought is I would suggest that we adopt the zoning for downtown and the odds, adopt and wait on adopting the zoning for site H for the odds to come in. But I just want to make sure that as we do that, no one is surprised if a proposal comes in next week and has to be processed, because not passing the zoning really doesn't do much. I did have one question, and then I'd love to hear what other people are saying. I thought Jeff Chanin made an interesting point about the finding that's required in order to approve zoning with regard to health and safety. Is that something that is an analysis that town council agrees with, or is that Not?
Well, off the top of my head, I do know that those two standards are very different. The standards of making those findings in the Housing Accountability Act is very different than making those findings in the zoning ordinance. But how they differ and the level of detail, I wouldn't be able to answer that tonight. Right, and an application to a specific project as well.
Okay, so maybe one additional thing that we could do is look into the question of whether or not adopting zoning has any estoppel effect on later arguments the city might want to make.
Thank you. Go ahead. Go ahead. It's up to you. Go ahead if you like. Please, go ahead. Vice Mayor Fredericks.
So let me pick up sort of.
Get it off.
Let me pick up here. There doesn't seem to be a consequence in delaying the zoning, really. However, I am concerned that we have a hard stop on the delay. And my concern about it is just this idea of an ADU survey. It really is a different process when you try to assess validity than the survey of mixed use property owners who were asked if they were willing to rezone. That had a potential to increase the value of their property. There's really no particular incentive here except maybe fear of losing the ability to build an ADU in the future, even though you promise no consequences. They will be on record as a person who said they wouldn't. And it doesn't guarantee building either. And so that may get us through this part of the process, but it'll come back to bite us in the update in the next 8-year cycle when we will have the unbuilt units added on to whatever RENAs are given us at that time. And that's just the downside of waiting and of surveying and hoping it's going to be the answer. Having said that, I really have no big issue with delaying, as John described, the rezoning of Site H at this time. I would like to, though, also point out that Ross is not a gold standard. They have not rezoned. Their housing element, I don't think, has been accepted yet. They were trying to predict 10 a year based on the fact that they built 27 ADUs last year. Tiburon built 29 in 7 years. So we're in a different position trying to validate that these ADUs are a prediction of what will be built. That said, because of the community dedication to bringing up the shortcomings of the site and the possibility of any alternative, I have no problem with delaying the zoning.
Thank you very much. So I'm on the same page, and thank you for taking the words right out of my mouth. I appreciate that. But I will make a couple of quick comments about the ADUs in particular. One thing with respect to what Ms. Jacobs said about how potentially delaying the zoning of Site H would be viewed negatively by HCD. I would say if we pursue a program that promotes ADUs, that would sort of offset whatever negative perceptions. And so that would be a further impetus for us doing that. And then a comment to staff, because I know you've talked about how fraught this could be. I'm speaking for them now and saying that that's just another tough decision that we're going to have to make, and I'm fine with that. In terms of, it's possible that we have, if we have 200 people show up with shovels, HC is going to have to say, oh, yeah, they're right. But if we have like 111 letters, that's a decision that we eventually will have to make and say,
what's
do,
enough?
do we feel comfortable pursuing this with HCD, knowing the risks of delaying? It's going to be a tough decision. I can see it falling in the gray zone. I'm just warning you all now, but it's worth trying. I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing. I definitely think that directing staff to pursue the odds on the hillside non or multifamily thing is the right thing to do straight away. And so with all that said, I'm asking a question perhaps to you. Does it make sense in terms of the ordinance to just sever out Site H and then proceed with that amendment? And then the ADU thing is and odds things are direction outside of the ordinance, or what do you?
Yes, so if the council sounds like there's all three of you want to sever out site H. We actually have a version of that ordinance that we're going to now give you all, so there's no confusion of what that would look like, so we can read it to the record. If you move for that, we'll provide a copy for the audience, and we'll also put it up on the screen so we all can see those edits. And then that would be the first reading of the ordinance. And and to get to the mayor's point about the odds and the ADUs, that's just direction. That's not part of the ordinance.
It's fine.
Except what about the idea that, it's probable, I don't know, I don't want to speak for them, but I would be comfortable saying that we want to wait for the odds unless the odds are going to come after January 31st. So do we need language in there?
Yeah, I don't even, I think the two things that I would propose in terms of direction are that we direct staff to work with the public to come up with a attempt to survey how many people would be significantly interested in building ADUs in the next 8 years. The second one is just severing site H until the council goes back to it. I don't think we have to put a specific time on it.
Great, okay. That makes sense, right?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
And so you guys are going to go over the changes now, right?
Yes, the community development director will walk you through the changes that are different from the one in your packet, so everyone is clear about the version that you'd be doing a first reading on tonight.
Okay, thanks.
All right, now that I've given out all the party favors, I have one more if anybody else wants one, but let me move can I operate it or? Okay, so could you move to page 4? Please. So as you can see, I have struck the item that refers to rezone for. Yes. Oh, that's right. Sorry. So on page 2, let's move back. I'm sorry. I skipped ahead. The first item that I have taken out of the ordinance with respect to site H is number 3 on page 2, where you'll see the blue line. It's very hard. Can we turn the lights down a little bit in here? So people can see, because it's in blue on the screen, which makes it a little difficult. There we go. So thank you, Lee. So we have taken out any reference to Paradise Drive, site H, in number 3 in 2 locations. That's the first change there. And then if you move to page 4, please. Once again, the reference at the top of the page has been taken out, reference to site H. So kind of excised it from the project here. And then if we move to page 7 in table 1-1, we take out the reference to the zone as R3-10 and the general land use designation as well. Trying to remember, I should have tabbed them. And then if we move on to page, and stop me if I miss something, Mary, page 13. It was, scroll down, it was F. And we removed F, and then G therefore became F and H became G. So we organized the numbering there as a result, but we took out the reference to R3-10. And then if you move to, let's see. Yes, if you move to 15 on the chart, you'll see at the top, there's a strikeout for and R3-10. So we move that. And then at the bottom of the page with the key to the zoning districts, we took out R3-10 as well, since if we're removing it, we don't need a key. And then this one should have been on page 16.
We should have struck the, so could you stop, please? Permit required by district R3-10 on that page should also be struck. And then the reference to the zoning district, I did strike at the bottom. And then if you go to page 18 in the table, I took out the reference to R3-10 and the site specifics that are related to that site. And since I couldn't take out the 30%, 15 and 8 because it relates to R3 as well. And then at the bottom on the open space standards below that, if you move down the page to B, I took out R3-10 with respect to the usable open space reference. And I believe, let me make sure. I think that's where we don't have any. No, because it's commercial. Did you find anything? I think those are the changes.
And if I may, Mayor.
And in the zoning map, we're going to need to make that change where we remove the designation in the zoning map. I'll have to admit that I did not have the graphic skills to do that tonight. And so that will be removed as well because it's in reference on the zoning map that relates to the zoning text. Thank you.
Ms. Wagner, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, council members, I think that Ms. Tasani did a great job of carving out all the references to the R3-10 zoning district from this ordinance, but we understand if this is the direction that the council takes, that if there are any other, cleanup changes, that your direction would be to make those as well, so that you've considered those as part of this first reading. It's to remove any references to the changing of site H to an R3-10.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be great. And Dina, thank you so much for doing this. I don't know how many trees had to be cut down to get all the iterations of the potential things we could have considered, but
There were many.
I'm glad you had this one.
But I
Thank you.
think I'll recycle everything. Thank you.
No, seriously, thank you. That was impressive foresight to have I'm sure you had a bunch of different things contemplated that we could have gone and to have this one.
I have a lot of piles you could have chosen from.
No, this is great. Thank you. We then, I'm looking for a motion to read the ordinance by title only as amended. That's what I need to do?
So moved.
And then I'm going to read the title of the ordinance and I have to throw in as amended somewhere, but so this is an ordinance of the town council of the town of Tiburon, amending provisions of Title IV, Chapter 16 zoning of the Tiburon Municipal Code by amending Division 16-14 zoning map, 16-20 requirements for approval of development and new land uses, 16-21 residential zones, 16-22 commercial zones, 16-23 downtown zones, 1632 parking and loading standards, 16-50 application filing and processing, 16-52 permit review and decisions, 16-70 inclusionary housing and density bonuses, and 16-100 definitions, adding a new definition, 16-29, which is overlay zones, and amending the town of Tiburon zoning map and applicable amendments. So now I need a motion.
If I may, Mayor
We had to
Ryan, just
vote.
for ultimate clarity, it's to include the amendments read into the record by the Community Development Director, handed out to the council on the dais, and then shown also on the screen with direction to make any corresponding cleanup changes to remove any references to site H and R3-10.
Exactly. Thank you very much. And then we need to vote on that, right? So,
Second, so.
Yeah, we need a second,
Second.
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
and now we'll do a roll call vote.
Okay. We have a roll call vote. Madam Clerk?
Councilmember Ruthier is absent. Councilmember Wellner,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Fredericks.
Yes.
And Mayor Ryan.
Yes. Okay. And is that all I need to do?
That's all you need to do
All right.
for tonight.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, let's see what we can come up with.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So at this point, we'll move on to public hearing 2, which is the Cypress Hollow Landscape and Lighting District item. Thank you all for coming tonight. Um, Do do we have a staff report for public hearing 2? Hey,
Yes, we do. Okay, good evening, council members and members of the public. We're here this evening to for a public hearing in regarding the landscape and lighting district for the Cypress Hollow subdivision. In summary, what we're doing this evening again is conducting a public hearing regarding the fiscal year 23-24 assessment, and also adopt a resolution confirming the assessments and ordering a levy and collection. Here's a map of the Cypress Hollow landscape lighting district. It is in the northwest quadrant of the peninsula. Here is a map showing the boundaries of the district, which is outlined in red, with the yellow areas indicating the district itself, what the town maintains, the park in the middle there. On the east side, you've got a 25-foot easement. On the west side, again, another 25-foot, 20 to 25-foot easement, and then the entrance. The landscape district is governed by the Landscape and Lighting Act of 1972. It was established by Marin County in 1990. It comprises of 44 parcels. The town annexed and assumed the district in 1998, and the funding that we're collecting from the parcels pays for supplements the landscape and irrigation on the east boundary corridor, the entry, the park, and also the southwest boundary corridor. So there's 3 steps involved in the process here. The first one was to order an annual engineer's report. That was done April 19th this year. Then the second step is to approve the engineer's report, which was approved by town council on May 17th, and establish a public hearing for today, which is on June 7th, and that's where we're here this evening. And here we're going to confirm the assessments, order the levy and assessments, and then transmit the assessments to the county assessor. So the assessments unchanged from the prior years. It's still $378 per parcel. The diagram's not changed. Nothing has changed since 98 or 90 since it was established. On the right-hand side, we have the annual assessments. Services, cost recovery for services, what staff does. We're asking for $7,000. This is again for fiscal year 23-24. Materials and supplies for the park and for the entrances, $5,000. MMWD watering of the park and entrances, $3,000. Tree maintenance, $15,000. Total cost for fiscal year 24 here, $30,000. Fund analysis, beginning fund balance as of June 1st of 23 will be negative $32,255. Our estimated revenues from collection of the parcels will be $16,632. Our estimated expenditures are $30,000. So at the end of this upcoming fiscal year, June 30th, 2024, we'll have $18,887 in our reserve. And just a reminder, last year we asked town council to contribute close to $31,000 to zero out our account. That's why we have 18,000 left in there.
But that 32,255 number, that's not negative, right? That's positive.
Positive, correct. And that's based on the $31,000 that that town council contributed last year. And just so that town council is aware, last year we estimated for this fiscal year that we were going to spend about $37,000 in Cypress Hollow. We only spent $20,000. So that's why we have a positive 18,000 estimated that will remain in this account at the end of next year's next fiscal year. So again, recommendations for this evening: conduct a public hearing regarding the fiscal year 23-24 assessment, and then adopt a resolution confirming the assessments and ordering levy and collection. And we have any questions, we'll be able to answer them this evening.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Do we not have a CPI escalator on the annual dues for this group? It's crazy. Any public comment?
We have a surplus.
Yes. Do we have anyone in the chambers who wants to speak on this item? Anyone online who'd like to speak on this item?
Seeing none.
Seeing none, I will close the public comment period and bring it back to council for discussion and or a motion. And if you're looking for a motion, it would be to adopt a resolution confirming the assessments and ordering the levy and collection of assessments within the landscape and lighting district in the Cypress Hollow subdivision for fiscal year 2023-2024.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, none opposed. That is adopted. Thank you. Public hearing 3 is the fiscal year 2023-2024 municipal budget and capital improvement program. Could we have a staff report of that, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good evening, council members, members of the public, and staff. So I'm going to go through the presentation for our proposed fiscal year 2024 budget. First, I want to thank the Finance Committee made up of Mayor Ryan and Vice Mayor Fredericks, who met several times with staff over the last couple of months on the proposed budget, and appreciate your guidance on that. And also just a reminder to council that at the council retreat, and don't have the date in my head right now, we did review in detail the proposed capital improvement program, which we will cover again in summary at the end of this presentation. Just a couple of notes on the proposed budget. First, one of the first things we always do is make sure that the new budget includes all the contractually obligated cost living increases for represented employees. And just a reminder, we have 2 classes of employees who are represented. We have the Police Officers Association, and we also have some maintenance workers in Public Works who are represented by SEIU. The budget also includes the contractually obligated increases for those groups. And in addition, it includes a 3% cost of living increase for all unrepresented employees. It also includes the appropriate step or merit increases for all employees who are not at the top of their range. The one thing that it does not include, probably the biggest item, which we talk about fairly frequently throughout the year, is the American Rescue Plan. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation. But as I go through the budget, just keep in mind that the American Rescue Plan funds are kept in a segregated account, and they're not part of our operating budget or our CIP. So big picture for the proposed budget, and I should have changed the fiscal year in the top of the slide. I just noticed it should be 23-24. The total appropriations for the town are proposed at about $26.5 million. That's broken up into 4 categories. The top category, debt service, is a little bit misleading. I tell council this at every presentation, that the town has no conventional debt that the town is responsible for. What we do is we pass through property tax revenue for the various undergrounding districts that have been formed and are still paying off the bonds for that utility undergrounding. So that 1.6 million at top is the total of those debt payments we're projected to make next year. It has no effect on the town's budget one way or the other. The other 3 categories are the capital improvement program, which again, we discussed at the retreat and we'll touch on briefly at the end of this presentation. There's a small category of what we call capital and technology outlay. And that's typically where we purchase vehicles, for instance, from, or replacement equipment. And then, of course, the biggest one, in which we'll spend the most time on today, is what we call the operating budget or the operating expenditures. Big picture, when we compare what we call revenues and sources to expenditures on the operating side, the budget we're proposing indicates a small surplus of about $17,760. We call it revenues and sources because it's a combination of what we call general fund revenue, and that's about $13 million. And we'll go into some detail about general fund revenue in the next few slides. But there's also revenue that funds the operating budget that's not general fund. The biggest example of that is we have a property tax pass through that we do for the library agency, and that's about $2 million. So that's in that other sources number, basically. So looking specifically at revenue, and again, we're going to focus on what we call general fund revenue, and that's revenue that comes into the town from sort of an outside source that can be used by the council for virtually any purpose it wishes. We break revenue down, or general fund revenue down, into 9 categories, and I'm not going to read each one of these, but this is the increase or decrease in the categories of revenue, and you can see, as usual, the biggest increase we normally see is our property tax revenue. So that category is projected to increase about 6.8%, or 461,000. And I'm not going to read the rest of the categories, but you can see how the other categories are broken down. Most of them are going up. We have a couple of modest decreases in revenue, at least in dollar amounts. I will point out about halfway down the page is investment income. That's the money, all the money that we keep in reserve that's invested in what we call LAIF, the Local Agency Investment Fund. And just like all of your savings accounts and CDs, the interest rate on LAIF has been going up fairly significantly over the past year. So we're predicting a sizable increase in investment income. When you look at the revenue in a pie chart, those same 9 categories, you can see how it breaks down. And clearly, between property taxes and other taxes, it covers, roughly 70, over 70% of all of our revenue. And you can see the corresponding sizes of the other categories that were listed on the prior page. I'm now going to go through about 6 slides, I believe, with individual history of some of our biggest revenue generators. So our single biggest one is the secured property tax, and this is the property tax that property owners in Tiburon basically pay on their tax bill. Is our portion, the portion that we receive of the property tax. And just for a point of reference, this question often comes up. People say, "Oh, I pay my property taxes," and they think all of their money they spend or they send to the county comes to the town. For every dollar of property tax that somebody pays to the county, the town actually receives about 7.5 cents of that dollar. So you can see, though, over time, this is a very linear increase through good times, not so good economic times, through the pandemic. This amount, at least for Tiburon and Marin in general, it consistently goes up, and it's been very reliable. And these projections are provided to us by the county assessor's office as we're putting the budget together. There's another category of tax called property tax in lieu of vehicle license fees, and it's tied to the assessed value of property in Tiburon. So again, it's not exactly linear to the property tax, but because it's based on assessed value, it goes up on a regular basis and again is very predictable. Now we're going to go through some of the sources of revenue that aren't quite as predictable. So here's transient occupancy tax. The town has 2 hotels. We charge a 10% transient occupancy tax on the gross revenues of those hotels. You can see this varies over the years, and of course during the pandemic took a big hit, has recovered pretty nicely. I will point out in all of these graphs that this point is an estimate for this fiscal year. So June 30 coming up, this is our estimate. And of course, this is a projection for next year. Moving left, these are all actuals from prior fiscal years. For sources of revenue that are not as predictable, like property tax, we tend to be conservative when we're projecting in the next year. So you can see it's basically flat from what we expect to see this year. Another revenue source that's varied over the years is sales tax. And again, you can see during the pandemic, it took a slight dip, but has recovered nicely over the past 3 or 4 years. And we're with the opening of a number of new restaurants and other businesses, we're projecting that the sales tax will modestly increase over what we project at the end of this fiscal year.
Is that the main driver of the run up there? Is the opening of new restaurants, or?
Well, it's a little hard to know. I mean, if you recall during, say, 2017, 18, 19, although that wasn't the pandemic, we were seeing an increased vacancy rate on a lot of our commercial properties in downtown, with plans for a lot of renovations. And of course, now those renovations got mixed up in the COVID period, but they're coming to fruition now with Malibu Farm opening just a couple of weeks ago. I understand Servino's is going to open. So I'd say yes, the driver of this increased sales tax revenue is probably in large part to some of the large restaurants opening over the past few years.
He wanted you to say it was because of the mayor that we had at the
Yeah,
time.
we could have said, yeah, I forgot to say that, Jack. I apologize. I went off script, but this is the category of revenue that's impossible to describe. It's called the Education Revenue Augmentation Fund, and it's loosely tied to a tax deal that the state made with the cities and towns years and years ago that basically took a pile of money away from the cities and towns and gave it to education uses in the state. But to partially make up for that, they created this what we call ERAF program. And as you can see, it's been somewhat erratic over the years. So we are always cautious when we're projecting what we think we're going to get from ERAF, but it has increased nicely over the past few years. And the county has indicated that they don't see any precipitous drop in what we'll receive in ERAF. I believe this is the last individual slide for revenue, and this just shows you our building permit revenue. Again, over the years, spikes, it can spike up and down. It was trending down pre-COVID. It sort of went up during, in the middle of COVID and towards the tail end. We're seeing a little dip this year. So this one's a little hard to predict, but we're comfortable that the projection for 2024, which will be a slight increase over what we're bringing in this year, is realistic. I'll stop for a moment see if anyone has any questions regarding revenue. We're going to switch over to the expenditure side. Okay, thanks. So when we look at total operating expenditures of 16 million, overall, that's an increase of about 5.1% or 780,000. Keep in mind, though, that operating expenditures do include a number of items unrelated to the day-to-day operations of the town. And I already mentioned this once. You'll probably mention it 3 or 4 times during this presentation. The single biggest item that fits in that category is this property tax pass-through. We receive the property tax that ultimately is destined for the library, and we pass it on to them. Why we do that, I can't tell you. I'd have to research when the agency was created, why they just don't receive it directly from the county is a question I don't know the answer to. But this single item increased about, I'd say 150,000 this year. So it has the effect of sort of artificially changing our operating expenditures, even though it has no effect one way or the other on the surplus or deficit, because it's a dollar for dollar pass through. So what we do is we tend to talk about general fund expenditures. So you'll see that nomenclature here throughout the rest of the presentation. And overall, general fund expenditures are, well, the salary and wages make up one of the biggest chunks of general fund expenditures, and that category is projected to increase just about 6% or $332,000 or so. And just a reminder that the town is made up of, I believe it'll be 42 employees or 43 employees if this budget is passed, which includes a new position in the admin department. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. And again, just repeating that the draft budget includes the contracted COLAs for the folks who are represented. That's the TPA and the SEIU, and a 3% COLA and merit increases for unrepresented employees. When we look at general fund expenditures by category or by object is what we call it, you'll see salaries and wages off to the right, and then employee benefits down at the bottom make up a good percentage of the budget. The next biggest chunk is what we call supplies and services, and that covers a wide variety of things we buy and people we pay to do things, essentially. Then the next smallest category is called capital outlay allowance. This is a little bit of a misnomer. This is the depreciation we charge our own departments for the aging of essentially their equipment, more or less. So we charge the departments a depreciation amount, which totals in this budget $314,000. That money gets put into a reserve fund for capital equipment and technology equipment. And that's one of the other sources that I talked about as well when we talk about revenues and sources. When we look at the general fund expenditures by department, you can see the police are the biggest department, which makes sense. They have the most employees and they operate 24/7. And the other departments are fairly similarly in terms of pie, and you can see how that breaks down for the rest. Now we're going to go briefly through each department and talk about any significant changes. The first department is the town administration department, which of course includes my position as well as the town clerk, Director of Administrative Services, and staff in the Director of Administrative Services division, or that part of the department. And also you see the town attorney here is shown off as sort of a working with the town manager, but reports directly to the council. So this is the single biggest change in the budget, and operationally we are asking for council to approve a new position, and it's colored in green. This would be a position dedicated to working directly with the accounting finance manager, and it would be an accounting finance technician position. Currently, staff in the department work back and forth sometimes on HR, admin stuff, and finance stuff. We're realizing now that the finances of the town require sort of more dedicated staff that are, spending all of their time essentially working on accounting and finance. When you look at the department or the town administration department as a whole, it's broken up into 4 divisions, if you'd like. The admin department, where all the staff is. There's the legal services department, which of course pays for all the legal work we have done, whether it's done by our town attorney or a separate agreement with other attorneys for any reason. The town hall budget is essentially the money that takes care of this building. And then we have what's called a legislative support division. And that's where the money for the various boards and commissions is, for special events, and any expenses associated with council members training or traveling for work-related business. Looking really quickly at the town administration budget, the overall increase is 394,000, and that's about 16.4%. And of course, the largest increase in this is that new position, which is $130,000 of that 394. Based on our experience over the past couple of years, we are anticipating that we're going to overexpend the legal expenses budget, this year's budget, and we are projecting or asking for an increase in the legal expense budget to account for that. As all of you know, we are going to have an election in August, and because it's a special election and there likely will be no other entities contributing to the election costs, we will be on the hook for the whole thing, and it's estimated at about $45,000. I'm going to move on to the community development department, which of course is planning and building, and there are no organizational changes projected. So this is the exact same org chart that you saw last year. There's actually an overall decrease in this budget of $80,000, but I would note that this decrease is largely due to the fact that we're taking out a lot of money that was allocated this year for this long-range planning general plan update process. If you factor that out, there would have been an increase of 161,000 or 8.9%. The biggest single item that's causing that is the middle bullet, which is last year council approved sharing a sustainability coordinator position with Mill Valley. And this $80,000 is the first budget year that we're putting it in the budget.
I have a quick question. Has there been any further consideration of hiring someone for code enforcement? Is that something that?
So I believe we will, we're not proposing a brand new position for code enforcement. We're hoping there's only so much we can absorb in 1 year in terms of new positions and getting things done. I made a decision that the admin position was probably more critical at this point. We are going to try to explore ways this year on how we can do code enforcement better. Now, it may not be a full-time person, maybe it's a contractor or part-time. There is some money in the budget that we'd be able to utilize this year for contractual services to experiment perhaps a little bit. But if there's a proposal that comes during the fiscal year that we're comfortable that's going to help us in any way, we can certainly come back to council for a budget amendment.
Yeah, it comes up when there are code issues, but people don't feel appropriate calling the police about them. There's someone to reach out to.
Right. Yeah. No, there's a lot of good reasons for it. Again, it's more a matter of how much can we bite off all at once. The budget we're proposing is about a $17,000 surplus.
It's close. Yeah.
Again, looking at the department, it's broken up into two divisions, planning and design, and then building. Going to switch to police, which again is our biggest department's budget. Again, no organizational changes projected this year or proposed this year. I will remind council that you all approved a new captain position in last year's or this year's budget, the current year. So that position remains, but there's no other proposed new positions. And when we look at the police budget as a whole, it's broken up into two divisions, the police department, and then we have a small budget for the police EOC facility, which is essentially just to maintain the building, the police department building. Overall increase in the police is 9% or 420,000. Big chunk of that is salary and benefits. I will note that there is a $50,000 line item for what we're calling a trainee position. Council may recall that last year you approved the creation of a new job classification called police trainee. And that's in the event that we found an applicant or a candidate who is either not currently going to the academy or currently in the police academy, we would have the opportunity to hire that person as a trainee while they're completing their academy work. We have no particular person in mind here. The $50,000 is in the event that during the year we find somebody and we have an opening that we'd like to utilize that for. It also includes the replacement of 3 additional department vehicles. And there's actually a total of 4 vehicles in the budget being proposed. All 4 would be EVs, and they would be replacing internal combustion engine. Also includes money for 3 new mobile data computers in the vehicles, as well as a required upgrade to what we call our mirror radios. These are the 2-way radios that are used, the handhelds, and the mirror system is experiencing an upgrade that's going to go live next year, and we're all required to buy new radios for that. Also, we contract with the sheriff for a number of services, and that total cost of that contract is going up by $37,000. Last but not least, the Public Works Department. And you may recall in this year's budget, we sort of divided instead of having one Public Works director, we divided the Public Works Department into 2 divisions, one engineering and one operations. So this reflects that dynamic in the org chart. When we look at Public Works expenditures, it's broken up into a number of divisions. The parks and streets maintenance divisions combined are clearly the largest chunk. We have admin and engineering, and then there's some smaller pieces to take care of the courtyard, the Cypress Hollow district, which you all just discussed at the prior public hearing. And we have what's called a street and single light maintenance division as well. There are no organizational changes projected for the Public Works Department this year, but with salary changes, they have mirror radios as well, and some other small increases of street speed survey and some increased contract money for median maintenance makes up some of the biggest changes, individual changes. We have there's a department we call non-departmental, and this where it's sort of a conglomeration of things. This is where we pay insurances. It's also where we pay out, for instance, the dues we owe for all the JPAs that we're members of. Richardson Bay Regional Authority, the Yellow Bus Challenge are the two that come to mind. There's a whole host of other JPAs that are detailed in the budget document itself that we pay dues to, and that's where this is captured. This is also where that pass-through for the Peninsula Library JPA is as well. And again, there's no effect on the town's surplus or deficit with changes in the library pass-through. So when we look at the non-departmental budget as a whole, it's basically remaining flat. There are, however, a number of individual changes that go up and down. This is the final year, the year we are in, FY23 is the final year that we're budgeted to make a contribution to the library expansion project. You may recall council agreed to pay $150,000 a year for 4 years. So this is year 4. This is the budget that this came out of. Related to the library, but a separate issue, that the increase in the library agency pass-through is going up. And again, it gives the impression of our expenditures going up, but there is a corresponding revenue increase to match it dollar for dollar. And then when we look at all of our insurances as a pool, like workers' comp, property and liability, All of our insurances are going up by a total of about $66,000. I'd like to show this graph. This shows you a historic look at revenues and expenditures going back a number of fiscal years. The expenditures are red, the revenues are in green. And again, I'll point out that this is these are estimates for the end of this coming fiscal year. And this, they look like they're right on top of each other. This is essentially the $17,600 surplus. We're projecting revenues will exceed expenditures. And again, I say this every year. If I went back last year and showed you this slide, it would look exactly the same. What typically happens is council adopts a budget that gives the staff flexibility to provide excellent service, but we generally generate a surplus at the end of every year that exceeds the budgeted surplus by a significant amount. All right, so that's sort of the end of the operating budget. I'd stop if anyone has any questions specifically about sort of departments and day-to-day.
Any questions for town manager?
No. I'm going to move on. So the capital improvement program, or what we call the CIP, I'll remind council that we went through a detailed project by project review of this at the council retreat. The numbers have actually changed a bit, unfortunately. And this is later on tonight, you're going to be hearing a presentation and being asked to approve several contracts related to paving. At the time of the retreat, the numbers we were using for the CIP were engineers' estimates. We opened bids a couple of weeks ago. So we actually have bid numbers now for a number of the paving projects, which significantly increased the total CIP, I think to the tune of about $1.2 or $1.4 million. And you'll see that as we go through future items when you're asked to consider the paving contracts. So as it stands, the CIP is broken up into three big categories: street improvement projects, drainage improvement projects, and community and miscellaneous projects. The total CIP proposal is $8,086,151. And as the note says, with few exceptions, the 23-24 projects are really focusing on maintenance, repair, or upgrade to existing town infrastructure. We're not proposing to build anything new. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but the next three slides are the tables that you saw at the CIP retreat, updated, and on this slide, updated for the paving costs, which are the captured in these areas here. So these are all the streets improvement projects. And I should have mentioned, I have both David and Patrick from Public Works here. And if you have specific project questions, they'd be happy to try to answer them for you. Switching to drainage, these are the three drainage projects that we're proposing for the CIP. And the last category is the community and miscellaneous project. And I would just note that included in this CIP is purchase and cleanup of the RBSD ponds at $900,000. So. And that's a project that council has previously already approved, more or less, and we're just waiting to get it done. So the town maintains fund reserves in a number of categories. We can break them down into two big categories. One is what we call general fund reserves, and these are reserves that the town council can earmark for things, but they're not restricted in any way, meaning the council can choose to use these general fund reserves for any sort of lawful purposes that the town can spend money for. We do have a category of reserve funds called restricted reserve funds. And those are funds where the source of revenue for those funds is typically an outside source, for instance, gas tax. Those revenues or funds can only be used for restricted purposes, and the council has no leeway on moving those funds or using them for general fund purposes. So when this chart shows you the bottom line is the restricted fund balances going back for a number of years. The middle line are what we call general fund reserves going back a number of years. And the top line is just the combination of those two bottom lines. So total reserves is that green line. You can see over the years, this goes up and down, and I will only note that again, the town has no conventional debt, so we're not a town that has floated bonds, for instance, to do street maintenance. So when you operate the way we do, which is we tend to generate surpluses, build up our reserves, and then spend them, this pattern is fairly common and is what you would predict, actually. Whereas if a town floated a bond, say to do street improvement projects, your CIP expenditures would be linear because you'd be making bond payments that were equal each year, presumably.
Okay, and I just want to make a note here for our discussion at the end. I think as we discussed when maybe this was at the retreat, as we discussed at a prior time when we were looking at this chart, while it is true that it goes up and down, the drop for this year is the most precipitous by far, and I'm just wondering if we've
so I would have
adequately considered
sorry,
if we're on a spending spree or if it needs to happen, or you know, I think it merits discussion either now or at the end.
We're almost at the end.
Okay.
So
let's just put a note there.
Yeah, I suspect we'll come back to this slide. Before we get to the end, though, I do like to always touch base on, I did mention that the town has no conventional debt, meaning we don't have bonds that were issued on behalf of the town, but we do have long-term debt associated, particularly in two areas. One is what we call OPEB, or other post-employment benefits. And this is essentially the cost of providing retiree health benefits to our employees who are eligible for that benefit. These are the data here is always going to be a couple of years old because these reports are generated sort of in arrears by a couple of years sometimes, but it is the most current data we have. So based on our actuarial assessment, our OPEB liability is about $3.7 million. Several years ago, the town established what's called a Section 115 OPEB trust, where the town has deposited general fund dollars essentially to account for this liability. And currently we have about $2,905,000 in net assets in that trust. And that leaves you a liability of about $787,600, or a funded ratio of about 78.6. So,
and how much do we put in each year?
This particular one is the one where we charge each department 1% of salaries. So for this year, it's probably about $50,000 would go to this fund. And we're going to talk about the CalPERS one, which we have not made a contribution to in a number of years, and this budget also proposes no contribution. That's this slide. So kind of a similar analysis. The CalPERS accrued liability, or unfunded liability, is, well, the accrued liability is $43 million. We have on account at CalPERS $35,800,000 towards that liability. That leaves a sort of sub unfunded liability of about 7.3. The town also has established a Section 115 trust for CalPERS obligations, and that currently has about 1.68 million in it, for a estimated net UAL, or unfunded accrued liability, of about 5.6 million. And that's a funded ratio of almost 87%, which is a fairly significant increase, even just from last year's. And it's really due to the fact that CalPERS investments had a banner year in 2021. And they're continuously updating their actuarial requirements for payments based on each year's investment performance. So we know they didn't have such a great year in 2022, and probably maybe not so good in 2023 as well. So I would expect this to actually drop probably in the next couple of years. Our funded ratio may end up going down and our liability will go up.
This is a really high percentage, so.
But it's a little bit of and the next slide is even more interesting.
I think you said something, but I missed it. What are PAR's trust assets?
So so the town established two trusts one, I think 5 years ago and one 4 years ago. And it's instead of, in this instance, instead of sending, say, extra money to CalPERS or making an extra mortgage payment, we have set aside money that we control. It can only be used for CalPERS obligations, but the town council has the choice of when they use it or if they add to it. So it's a little bit of a money in the bank. For instance, let's say 2 years from now, there was another pandemic and the economy crashed, and for a number of years, the town's revenue stayed flat or decreased. One way the town could mitigate that loss of operating revenue would be for any number of years, make their CalPERS payments from this trust, as opposed to general fund revenue. That's sort of the idea of it. I think the council has done a great job setting up these trusts. One thing that we haven't really talked about in any great detail is when is the right time to actually perhaps use some of the money from the trusts. We don't really have a great plan for when a great time would be.
To pay into the unfunded liability.
That or make certain, remember, there are actually two categories of payments we make to CalPERS. One is what we call normal cost. So that's the percentage of salary, active payroll, active payroll that we pay CalPERS every month or every week, for each employee we have who's currently working. That's called normal cost. Then we have to make essentially a mortgage payment against our accrued liability. So you could say, you could use that PARS money to make either of those payments anytime the council wishes, and you can do it in arrears. You can actually make the payments with general fund dollars, and then you could ask for, you can get reimbursed by the trust for those.
And as long as it's in the PARS trust, is it earning interest or?
Yeah, so the PARS trust is much like an investment account, and the council, when they set the trusts up, the finance committee at the time chose an investment strategy for both trusts. That's a mixture of essentially stocks and fixed income.
Thank you.
So this is a projection from CalPERS on what our unfunded accrued liability payments will be. This is that mortgage payment that I talk about. This is not the normal cost. For as long as I've been here, when this slide comes up, I lament the fact that the increase is enormous and that the future increases look to be enormous as well. And again, because of that one great year, essentially, that CalPERS had in 2021, and they redid all their actuarial computations, this is now what they're projecting. We actually had a decrease this year of 46,000 in our required mortgage payment on the unfunded liability. And the projection is that it will continue to go down in future years. I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in the future years going down, but we know for sure what the payment's going to be for next year, which is the column that's highlighted in green or bordered in green. So.
And that is affected in general by the community.
You may have to use your microphone. I'm sorry, Councilmember Fisher or Vice Mayor.
And those payments, the amount of them is controlled by what, the economy, recession?
So it's based on CalPERS returns on any given year, and then when they have those returns, they run their actuarial numbers, and it's essentially a variable rate mortgage, and they sort of re-amortize your mortgage every year, looking forward, and you have no control over it, other than you could make extra payments. You can make additional mortgage payments, and that will reduce your future years payments, just like it would in your home mortgage. Or you could use again funds from the trust to offset any aberration in this, to soften the blow or flatten out the curve. So. The last two slides, I just want to remind council that I mentioned that the operating budget doesn't include any discussion, or it doesn't include any dollars associated with the American Rescue Plan. So I'd just like to refresh council's memory where we're at. The town received an allocation of $2.173 million over the past 2 years, the council has both expended and earmarked money for a number of projects. And this just lists those again. I won't go through each one. I will note that the second to last bullet, which is the late night ferry service, I learned last week that Tideline Marine is now out of business. So we have not expended the entire $298,000 amount, and I don't have that number handy tonight. I suspect we've expended about 230 or 40,000 of it, or maybe a little less. But I don't anticipate any other expenditures since they're out of business. So there may be a little more money left than this next slide will indicate.
Wow, they're entirely out of business.
They're out of business. Yeah.
I think we need to keep a record of the fact that this is, at least during my tenure, the second time that late night ferry service has been tried and found not workable.
This is just a continuation slide that these are the rest of the projects that you've all either authorized expenditures or earmarked. The long note at the bottom just indicates that the top item on this list is the broadband project phase 1 funds, which you allocated. Subsequent to you allocating the funds, we applied for and received grants to essentially do the exact work. So my assumption is that this money is still available, but the council hasn't really weighed in on it. Long story short, if the 150,000 is not spent on the broadband, you have about $371,000 that is unallocated, and that number would go up a little bit because of the Tideline issue that I just mentioned.
And so is the broadband project money only for planning, or can it actually be used for?
Oh, it could be
design.
Council. So these funds were earmarked for design and consulting. We subsequently received a grant to do the exact same design and consulting. So these funds theoretically would be available for council to use on anything. And if this project ever were to go, these funds could be used towards the construction cost.
Thank you.
Two quick notes. One is I just, for the record, to point out that it's a sea level rise study and not study of the rising of seals.
Oh, look at that. Thank you.
Which could be very dangerous, but I'm unaware of it happening. And then the second one is a question. While I know we're doing the Parks Master Plan, I'm wondering, was I not present? We didn't earmark this at the same time we earmarked the prior funds from the ARA funds.
All of the allocations that are listed on this slide and the prior slide were earmarked at different times. When you approved the Parks Master Plan, you specifically indicated that it should be paid for by
from the ARA. Okay, that's totally fine. I didn't recall that. Okay. And that's in the process of being spent as we're developing a master plan.
Correct. And just a reminder, ARP funds need to be obligated by December 2024, so another year and a half, and they need to be expended by 2026, I believe.
Okay. So
answer any questions?
Do we want to talk about the reserve issue, or do we have other specific questions we want to deal with first?
No, we can talk about the reserve issue.
So I remember we were when we last discussed this, there were some big chunks that explained a bunch of this. Maybe you could talk about that. I mean, what I see is going from 26 million to 18 million. So spending about $8 million in 1 year.
That's correct. I think it's about 8,086,000 if all the dollars were expended. I would point out a couple of things. One is 900,000 of that is the RBSD purchase of the property and cleanup.
Right.
One of the reasons why the surplus grew in the past couple of fiscal years is we had a paving project, which you're getting the iteration of it now. We had put a paving project out to bid, I believe, last fiscal year, and David and Patrick tell me if I'm wrong. would have been a multi-million-dollar project, but we received no bids. So the money was allocated, it was approved by council in the CIP. We put it out to bid, no bids. We chose not to move forward. So that's one of the reasons why the reserve grew. It was relatively large before this year, was those funds were never expended. And you'll see, well, you'll see in the next few items here in this meeting that the paving projects combined are, I think, close to $4 million, $4 or $5 million in this proposed budget. So it is a lot of money.
Yeah,
I
so
think what you'll hear, particularly on the paving, which is probably makes up half of that money. You'll see we received 3 bids for a couple of projects, so we received good bids. We don't believe paving costs are going to come down anytime soon, if ever.
So, I mean, the mayor and the vice mayor on the budget committee, I don't know if you have any thoughts about whether some breaks need to be put on this, or whether it's okay to spend, because we anticipate that the cost of paving will go down, so we might as well do it this year. It's just it really is kind of an unprecedented, what is it, quarter drop in our reserves.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have a view on whether the cost of paving will go down or not. And I think that the way I've been thinking about this is sort of, the lever that we have is, would we want to just sort of establish a lower PCI threshold, like a pavement compaction index threshold for the whole town, and just say, let's not have the best streets in Marin and pave less frequently and thereby reduce our long-term costs. I'm not saying I'm contemplating that. I'm just saying that in my mind is sort of the lever we have longer term. And then specifically with respect to this expenditure, I agree it's a lot of money. And then even if you sort of say, well, a bunch of it was going to be last year, it still represents a big 2-year drop. But that being said, we have the money, and people, we collect taxes so we can spend it for the benefit of the people. And this seems to be something that benefits everybody, given the number of complaints I've gotten about the potholes on Tiburon Boulevard in the last 4 months. People want their roads to be well paved. So I certainly agree that it bears monitoring, but this particular expenditure doesn't jar me in the way that makes me uncomfortable spending the money, but that's just my thoughts. Yeah, please go ahead.
And I do agree with Jack. And also you have to consider with respect to street paving, the longer you let them deteriorate so that the paving index is lower, the more costly per mile it is to keep the roads in good condition.
How do we compare to other towns?
I will defer to David and Patrick. I think we're the second highest PCI in the county. But we're not so sure about their town attorney in Ross. Just so you know.
And I just
was gonna say, we don't put the extra gold layer on our streets. So
like, do you guys have a sense, like, how much money is Caltrans is going to resurface all of Tiburon Boulevard in 2024, theoretically, right? Which may be 2025 or something, but like, they're also spending $1 million this week, right? Or something.
So they're placing about 1,500 tons of material.
If you're gonna, we should probably have you come.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Just because we won't catch it on a recording if.
And just to note, we've brought Joe Ryrie from Pavement Engineering Incorporated, who will also be helping us with our presentation subsequent to this. So Caltrans is placing about 1,500 tons of pavement. They'll actually be out there shortly, probably starting up tonight. And just material costs alone are around 150,000 is our estimate. Probably fully, the full cost, I'm guessing, is probably 300,000 to 400,000 at least, just for this effort, maybe more.
Thanks. And the only reason I bring that up is just because like the weather, I feel like has deteriorated or has the potential to have deteriorated streets more substantially in the last 18 months than it has previously. So like, I just feel like this is a good time to make sure your streets are in good condition, but
Yeah, I guess my comment about it is, it's a bit of a standardless exercise where, meaning no offense, if you put engineers in charge of making something run really well, they're going to make it run as absolutely well as it can, right? So money's kind of no object in a sense. So I'm sure the money is going to be well spent, absolutely it will be. But I guess the question is, how much do we need relative and for the second best in Marin right now? Maybe this will push us up to number one, but I don't know if it's something we need. So
we're
I'm
not-
just sort of unsure about how to think about it.
is that true that we're second best now and this will push us to number one?
Well,
Or are we,
the pushing number one is just a figurative comment, but
or is this to get us to number?
But let me say, you can also look at it, is that the higher our PCI, the lower our costs in the future.
I'm not sure that's true, but
It is. I will ask the engineer.
But I think we can get into this more when we talk about the paving projects, and Joe can help to explain this when we get to that point. But when they're grading roads to evaluate what the PCI is of these various road segments throughout the town, there's an index where the cost significantly increases based upon the condition of the road to maintain it. So in other words, once
Right, if
you
you drop
drop
below
off
a
a
certain
certain
threshold, yeah.
threshold, your costs peak. And what we're trying to do with these, at least the two highest cost projects, is to catch both to rehabilitate the streets that are in really poor shape, but also to catch the streets that we can maintain for a lesser cost before they fall off and the suggested treatment no longer becomes applicable.
in any case, tonight we're reviewing the budget. We're not making a decision.
Yeah, I was going to just say that, Councilmember Wellner, just to be clear that for this item, this is a preliminary budget review, this is
No,
what we're
that's
supposed to do.
That's exactly what we're supposed to do.
Have conversations and talk about it. However, what I'll say is, we plan to bring the budget back for adoption on June 21st. And also the next two items, action items, if you approve, then they will automatically become part of the budget, right? If you say, or these contracts for paving, then they by default become, built into the budget. So, but we're not asking you to make any decision on the budget as a whole or the CIP as a whole this evening. But it would be handy to have direction if there were going to be changes, because it's difficult for us to bring
Absolutely.
a
Well,
budget for adoption.
This is neither here nor there for this discussion, but it sounds like it's probably time for us to have a call and we'll just go through stuff together.
Sure. Yeah, happy to.
And then so I don't, at risk of speaking for my fellow committee member, one thing we talked about, and this doesn't necessarily have to come out of in the general operating expenses, because it can be handled by American Rescue Plan funds. But so generally speaking, the employees, it's like almost tradition that we give 3% COLAs. And some years that is high relative to the actual CPI, some years it's low, but it seems potentially that this year was particularly low relative to actual inflation. And, part of it you could see in the sales tax revenue, right? Part of it was certainly restaurants, but part of it was also inflation. So one idea that we considered was that we could keep the COLA at the level that we proposed, which is, or Greg showed is 3% plus the contractual ones, which are 2.5 or 2.75, depending on the union. But we could consider a bonus to employees, and 1% of the payroll is like $42,000. So we could consider doing that for employees as an opportunity to mitigate the inflation that they suffered this past year. And I know we just talked about spending.
I was gonna say that's the way of spending more rather than less,
Yes,
but
yes.
it is a nice idea.
So that's something that, when we come back and approve the budget, and we finalize that.
Okay.
That's all I, otherwise I'm obviously comfortable with the budget, as you know.
Okay.
If I may, we should open up public comment.
Oh, yeah, good call. So is there anyone in the chambers who'd like to speak on this item?
No.
Anybody online who'd like to speak on Zoom?
Seeing none.
Okay, I'll close public comment period. And then do you have the direction that you need?
Again, this was just a informational more, I
Yes.
mean, there wasn't any specific direction. I'm happy to chat with Councilmember Wellner offline. And, you know, the item that you just mentioned in terms of a bonus, you know, that doesn't necessarily even have to be part of the budget process. Council could make that decision right in August, or, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be part of the budget is my point.
No, that's a good point. Okay, thanks. So then we'll move on to action item 1. This is the 2023 storm drain rehabilitation project, and we're considering awarding a contract based on the bids. Could we have a staff report, please?
Yes, we do. Mayor, Vice Mayor, council members. This is the
1970s project.
2023 storm drain rehabilitation project. So in summary, what we're asking this evening of council is to authorize the town manager to approve the award of the contract for the 2023 storm drain rehabilitation project to Mixis Services for $516,519. Authorize the town manager to approve construction contract change orders up to 10% of the construction contract amount for unforeseen construction issues, and to authorize staff to include the fiscal year 2024 budget funding for this project in the amount of $568,171. So a little background here. Town advertised this project on May 9th, 2023. The engineer's opinion of probable construction cost was $504,700, and that included a base bid in the amount of $396,777. And what that base bid does is it installs cured in place liners, PVC liners, within the existing 12 and 24-inch diameter corrugated metal pipes that we have in town, and also a bid alternate in the amount of $107,300, and that is for centrifugally casted concrete pipe repair. And that's for a 48-inch CMP pipe that we have that they don't make liners that size. So currently cured in place liners don't come in 48-inch diameter sizes. So we have to use a different method, which is the CCP method is, it's almost like a remote robot that they send down the pipe with an arm that sprays concrete around it, and they pull that robot out, or that wheel out, and it uniformly sprays concrete inside that pipe evenly. So bids were for the project were open publicly May 25th, and the town received one bid from Mixis Services. The bid base bid was $393,123, and the bid alternate $123,396 for a total of $516,519. So here on this analysis here, on the left-hand side, we have a table showing what we have expended to date so far. So for fiscal year 22-23, we have spent $48,203 for the design and bid support for the project. For fiscal year 24, the construction came in at $516,519 the bid, contingency of 10%, $51,652 for a total construction cost of $568,171. As far as construction management, we're going to do that in-house. Staff will be the construction inspectors for the project, and there will be no environmental on this one because that was included in the $48,000 this current fiscal year. The bid is above the engineer's estimate by 2.4%. So it came in fairly close to what the engineer had predicted. This map here shows the location of all of the areas that we will be touching in town. There are, I believe, 12 locations in Tiburon that we will be lining the pipes and preserving what we have out there. Those three that you see along Tiburon Boulevard, they're actually culverts or pipes that go beneath our old rail trail pathway project, where it says project locations, see sheet 5, those three there. Again, here there's 12 work locations at streets below. So we have Reed Ranch Road, Seaforth Road, Vistazo West Street, Hawthorne Drive, Mar Vista Court, Mar East Street, Washington Court, and again, the old rail trail. So 12 locations within these 8 street segments, 7 street segments in the old rail trail. Here are some before pictures. These are how these corrugated metal pipes look. A lot of voids, a lot of deterioration underneath the bottom of the pipes. And another picture here showing some of the deterioration of the corrugated metal pipes. And then this last picture shows how the pipes will look once they're lined. This is an actual picture of our 2020 lining project. So we haven't had a project here since 2020. The 2020, this is how the pipe will look once it's lined with the PVC liner. It'll greatly improve flow, improve capacity, and stop deterioration, undermining of the pipes. In turn, reduce sinkholes, pavement collapses throughout town. And here's the proposed CIP budget for that we're requesting our town council to consider fiscal year 23-24 from the general fund, streets and drainage fund, $568,171 for this project. And again, the recommendations are to authorize the town manager to approve the award of the project to Mixis Services for $516,519. Authorize the town manager to approve construction change orders up to 10% of the construction cost for unforeseen construction issues, and to authorize staff to include the fiscal year 2024 budget funding for this project in the amount of $568,171. And with that said, both Patrick and I are available for any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for staff at this time? Is there anyone in the public who'd like to speak on this item? Anyone on Zoom would like to speak?
Seeing none.
Okay, I'll close the public comment period and bring it back to council for discussion and or a motion.
I will move to authorize the staff's recommendation.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion passes 3-0. Thank you, guys. And then secondly, we have action item 2 is awarding paving contracts, which we talked about a little bit before. Do we have a staff report on this one?
Yes, Mayor, Vice Mayor, Council, members of the public staff, we have here with me Patrick Kerslake, Operations Manager, Joel Ryrie, engineer on record for that developed these 2 projects here. So this evening we have the summary is that we're requesting town council or recommending town council to authorize the town manager to approve the award of the contract for the 2023 pavement rehabilitation project to Team Gelati Inc. for $2,217,217, and authorize the town manager to approve the construction contract change orders up to 5% of the construction cost for unforeseen construction issues. Second item is to authorize the town manager to approve the award of the contract for the 2022 pavement maintenance project to Doolittle Construction for $1,195,195, and authorize the town manager to approve the construction contract change orders up to 10% of the construction contract, again for unforeseen construction issues. Third item is to authorize the town manager to approve the construction management services contract with Pavement Engineering Inc. in the amount of $185,160 for both the 2023 pavement rehabilitation project and the 2022 pavement maintenance project construction management services. And then the fourth item is to direct staff to include in the fiscal year 2024 capital improvement program budget the amounts of $2,441,538 for the 2023 pavement rehabilitation project and $1,386,415 for the 2022 pavement maintenance project. So this right here is a chart showing the pavement condition index bar. So basically what it does, the PCI, it provides a snapshot of the pavement health of a road. It is measured on a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 is a brand new paved road, excellent condition, and below 25, we consider it a failed road. We use a pavement management program, PI provided this, the PTAP. They go out and they survey all of the roadway sections in town, and they use a computer database called Street Saver, and they input all of their findings in there. And what it does is it creates a PCI and predicts future PCI based on what the town's fundings are moving forward each fiscal year for our paving projects. This right here is the chart that Patrick was referring to previously. This is the pavement management program. So you've got on the left-hand side, the pavement condition from 100 all the way down to 0, which is excellent to failed. In that fair to excellent, that's the area there where we want to try to keep our pavement in. And you see on the right hand there where it has the pavement that occurs, you see those kind of like shark teeth. Those are the areas where we want to go in there and put in some treatment like a slurry to preserve our asphalt. And if you notice there, to preserve it, your cost in that area there is about $230 a square yard. $2, yeah, did I say $2.30 a square yard. If we go down below the fair and down into the poor and very poor, it can cost anywhere, $85 a square yard or higher to reconstruct it. So that's why we're trying to keep, it's not that we're trying to keep our PCI, have it be the best in Marin, which we do want that, but we also want to minimize how much the town is going to spend every year in preserving our current asphalt. The town currently has 36 center miles of roadway. 2 center miles are arterial. We have 3.2 in collectors. Majority of our streets are residential streets, 28.1 center miles, and then we've got some others. Our current average PCI right now, based on the 2022 report that was completed, is 74. Here's a pie chart that kind of shows, again, a comparison of where we're at. Over 52% of our roadway network is in good condition. 25% in the fair condition. 7% is poor. 1.5% is failed. Only 3 streets in Tiburon, and we're going to work on getting those up. And then 14% are excellent, in excellent shape. The town, what we did is we advertised again 3 paving projects on May 9th, the 2023 pavement rehab project, the 2022 pavement maintenance project, which is from last year, and then Eastview Avenue rehabilitation project. That project basically reconstructs Eastview from Alcatraz to Alcatraz on Corinthian Island. The engineer's opinion of probable construction costs for the 3 projects are as follows: $1.5 million for the 2023, $940,000 for the 2022, and about $379,000 for Eastview Avenue. Bids were opened publicly on May 25th. We received 3 bids for the 2023 streets. Team Gelati was the apparent low bidder at $2,217,217. We have Majora and Gelati very close to their bid at $2,253,637, and the Gelati Construction Company at $2,629,718. For the 2022 pavement maintenance project, last year we went out to bid twice on it, and we received 0 bids for that project. This year we received 3 competitive bids. Doolittle Construction, the parent low bidder at $1,195,195. Dryco Construction closely behind them at $1,246,000, and then Graham Contractors at $1,569,355. Then Eastview Rehabilitation project, we had 4 bids on that. VNH Builders at $368,000, the apparent low bidder. RK Engineering at $441,000, closely behind them, and then Gelati Construction at $515,000, and Majoran Gelati at $557,557. This evening, we're just asking town council recommend awarding the two 2023 and the 2022 projects. The Eastview Avenue Rehabilitation Project staff is continuing due diligence related to this project and plans to return to town council on June 21st with a recommendation to award the contract. VNH is a new contractor that we have not worked with. We want to make sure that all our T's are crossed, I's are dotted, check references, make sure that they're able to do the work on Corinthian Island. As you know, it is a very complicated street, narrow street, a lot of concrete work, a lot of ingress, egress from houses. In the past, we've had issues with other contractors that did not do very good job on various CIP projects. So we just want to make sure that we do our due diligence here before we award it. Here we have a breakdown again, as we did with the storm drain project. On the left-hand side, fiscal year 22-23, we've expended to date $113,305,000 so far on design and bid support. For proposed 23-24 projected cost, construction for the low bidder is $2,217,217. Construction contingency of 5% at $110,861. Construction management for this large project is $113,400 for a total cost of $2,441,536. Staff has worked with Team Gelati in the past. I want to mention they are separate. They're not GBI, as we had worked with previous projects, is Team Gelati. They have a valid contractor's license. They've submitted all their required forms, no bid irregularities, and they are the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. Their bid is over the engineer's estimate by $709,838. That's a 47% above, but they are within 2% of the second low bidder. So staff is recommending also town council authorize town manager to approve change orders not to exceed 5% for this project. The second project is the 2022 pavement maintenance project. Again, on the left-hand side, fiscal year 22-23 to date, we've expended $83,373 in design and bid support. For fiscal year 23-24 proposed cost, $1,195,195. That's the apparent low bidder. Construction cost, $119,520, 10% contingency, $71,700 for construction management for a total amount of $1,386,415. And again, we did do our due diligence. They do have a valid contractor's license. They've submitted all the required forms, no bid irregularities. They are the lowest responsive and responsible and responsive bidder. Again, with this project, they are above the engineer's estimate by $254,795, so 27%, but they are within 4% of the second low bidder. Staff again here is recommending town council authorize the town manager to approve change orders not to exceed 10% of the contract cost. This map here shows the location of all of the work with the two projects combined. We are touching, I believe, Patrick, 44 streets within the town, all over the peninsula, from the Old Town, right in the middle, up near Paradise Cay, as you enter Reed Ranch. So a lot of areas that we're going to be doing pavement rehab work this summer, if approved. Here, what we did is we broke down all the street sections that we're going to be doing work on based on what their current PCI is. So as you can see, we have a lot of blues that are at risk. We have orange, poor, and we have 4 or 5 road sections here that are in the green section. They're not excellent. They're in the high 70s. And these are streets that are basically getting some dig out repair and slurry to maintain them, to keep them in that $2.85 a square yard cost. Second sheet, again, we're continuing here. Again, a lot of poor street sections, a lot of at risk. And again, the 4 green sections are in the mid 70 PCI. And those streets, again, will have dig outs and slurry done to them to preserve them for another 5+ years. And the last sheet here, again, Monterey Drive is at risk. The other 4 streets are having some dig out work done and slurry coating on their treatment. Here's the proposed CIP budget. We're asking to use $2,375,973 from the Tiburon Street Impact Fund, $719,396 from the gas tax, the RMRA, the SB1 that you had just approved in consent, $500,000 out of that fund, and $232,584 from the transportation sales tax, or for total here, $3,827,953 for these 2 projects. And in summary here for recommendations, again, we are recommending town council authorize the town manager to approve the award of the contract for the 2023 pavement rehabilitation project to Team Gelati for $2,217,217, and also authorize contract change orders up to 5% of the construction contract amount for unforeseen construction issues. Also authorize the town manager to approve the award of the contract for the 2022 pavement maintenance project to Doolittle Construction for $1,195,195. And again, authorize the town manager to approve construction contract change orders up to 10% of the construction contract amount for unforeseen construction issues. Authorize the town manager to approve construction management services contract with Pavement Engineering, Inc. in the amount of $185,160 for the 2 projects, the 2023 pavement rehab and the 2022 pavement maintenance projects. And direct staff to include in the fiscal year 2024 capital improvement program budget the amounts of $2,441,538 for the 2023 pavement rehab project and $1,386,415 for the 2022 pavement maintenance project. And with that, all 3 of us are here to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for staff? Yeah, please.
So one thing that when we get back to the council discussing the issue that I'm going to ask is, since we're scheduled to approve the budget at our next council meeting, right, that we defer approving this until then, is there any reason that we can't wait 2 weeks?
I think the short answer is yes. It's one of the reasons we're bringing it you today. These, and Patrick and David, you can jump in if I get this wrong. The 2 projects are related, meaning one has to be done more or less prior to the other one being done. And we're trying to get it all done in a timely manner while school is out in some cases to limit disruption. And also, if we delay even 2 weeks, we may be bumping up against the second project not being able to be complete because of weather. Is that correct? Slurry sealing?
So yes, so the 2023 project has all of the asphalt work and dig outs. Dig outs need to be completed before the slurry project starts. So if we delay the dig outs and the pavement project, then the slurry will be delayed as well. They have a lot of crack filling that they have to do out there, and they need about 2 to 3 weeks for slurry. And we want to make sure they get all of this done before school starts.
And just it's of note that the project that we put out last year was a project that had slurry seal and pavement repairs combined. We didn't get any bids. What we decided to do, because we were due for a rehabilitation project this year, was to pull all of the pavement repairs out of the slurry seal project to try to get the most competitive bid for slurry seal. That's the maintenance project, just so that there's a little bit of distinction between what each project does. So the maintenance project is just slurry and striping so that one contractor can get us the best price. And the rehabilitation project is fixing all the potholes ahead of the slurry and paving a few select streets. So they're contingent on each other.
Do you guys have any sense in terms of, that given that the estimate was so far below, is it a materials and labor costs issue that our estimate was low, or is it just the fact that the road conditions have deteriorated, so there needs to be more work, or like what's the difference? Is there like something that a lesson we can take forward with future estimates, or how do we look at that?
I'm going to hand it over to Joe because he looks at these things for entities all over the Bay Area and the state, and may be able to give us a little bit more insight as to his analysis.
Thank you, Patrick. Mr. Mayor and members of the council. That's a very good question. We do see bids all over the Bay Area, and we are working with contractors and constantly watching the marketplace. Last year, there was a 30% increase in overall construction prices, and we're seeing a trend this year doing the same throughout the Bay Area, particularly, and I'm still trying to drill into it, but on the North Bay Peninsula, the costs seem to be going up. Whether that's the suppliers that are being limited and taxed in terms of what they're able to produce. One of the things that's happening with the paving marketplace throughout California and in the Bay Area is we have a limited number of contractors, and we are seeing a larger amount of paving work coming out. The public is getting frustrated, and we're doing things throughout the Bay Area, like passing increased sales tax measures and bond measures. And that's not only happening with cities and towns and counties throughout the Bay Area, but it is also happening in school districts. And oftentimes we forget that there's a lot of paving on school sites. And so these contractors are getting loaded up from a number of different places, and we're not seeing a lot of new contractors coming in. So it's becoming a supply and demand issue currently.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please go ahead.
So I have a smaller scale question for our engineers. At one time, there was a policy that a private road adjacent to one of our public paving projects could have an opportunity to log on to be part of the project paid for by the residents of those private roads. Is that still a policy? And if so, at what point do they have to come forward with their interest?
This is actually the first time I've ever heard that. So it's very informative. I would say that the opportunity probably would exist if the homeowners wanted to work directly with the contractors, if they had the time and materials available. I'm sure there could be efficiencies.
So their first opportunity would be when the town makes an award?
Yes, then we would be entering a contract with each respective company, and that would be publicly accessible information that the property owners would be able to contact the contractors and obtain a price for the work.
Thank you.
If there's no other questions, I'm going to open up for public comment. Are there any members of the public who'd like to speak on this item right now? Anybody on Zoom?
Seeing none.
Okay, I'll close the public comment period then and bring it back to council for discussion. I mean, I just don't see benefit from kicking the can down the road, but and obviously they have reasons for why we would go ahead and do it, but actually I should ask, can we reduce the scope of a project, or or would we have to rebid? Like,
Yeah, that is something that we talked about, trying to figure out how to sharpen our pencils on this and figuring out, we actually discussed with PEI what criteria they would use to drop streets off the project based upon cost savings and how removing certain treatments from the streets would affect both projects. And we came up with a handful of streets, but when we added up the amounts, it didn't add up to anything significant, unfortunately, enough to change the costs in the way that we were looking to get closer to the engineer's estimate.
Yeah, and added on, we were afraid if we came back next year with those same streets, they would actually cost more to pave.
Thanks. And I just so I'm clear, I normally don't do this, but remind me, there's a limit we can reduce too, right? Without going back out to bid.
25% of the
Total contract
total contract price.
for each bid item. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, so I mean, we talked earlier, this is kind of a record spend of 8 million to reduce the reserve, and this is fully half of that, right? This is 4 million. I don't feel like, based on what I have right now, I'm prepared to support it before I have further understanding of the total of the 8 million. I would ask that we put it off till the next council meeting. What I would say is, one thing that would be really useful would be maybe to have data of how much we've spent on paving each year over the last 10 years or something, to see if this is an aberration or if this is kind of a normal spend. I have a feeling this is probably double what we normally spend, but I don't know.
So my comment will be, having survived the trauma, maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, of having the town roads in deplorable condition with a very low pavement index, and scaring up the money to address that. I really am reluctant to repeat that experience, and am prepared to support the staff's recommendations.
Yeah, with all due respect to Councilmember Wellner, I know you have reservations, but I would, if you want to make a motion, I would second.
I will make that motion to support the staff's recommendation regarding the paving projects.
And I'll second that. And so we'll just take a vote. All in favor of approving the motion, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Nay.
The motion carries 2-1. Is that true, or do we don't need 3 votes? 2-1 is a successful motion?
No.
Oh, okay.
For a resolution for the payment of money, or order for payment of money, which it is, it needs the recorded majority of the body of 5. So we need 3 votes for that, so it fails.
Okay, so, but can we bring it back at the next meeting then? Or is that?
Bring another motion to reconsider and have it continue to the next meeting. That could
Okay.
be another motion.
I would make a motion that we reconsider and bring it back at the next meeting. Do you want to second that motion?
Sure, I'll second that motion.
And then all in favor of bringing it back to the next meeting?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone
Aye.
opposed? No. Okay, so we'll have to bring it back to the next meeting for consideration then. So now we'll move on to town council reports. Do we have any town council reports?
I
this
just
evening?
have a very short report from TAM. They've scheduled public workshops for the Tiburon Boulevard East Blythedale Interchange Project. It will be held June 20th, 6 p.m. Mill Valley Rec Center, Mountain View Room.
Thank you. Are there any town manager reports?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. With that, we are adjourned, and thank you everyone for your patience tonight.